Hello everyone, welcome to Bedtime Nightmares. I've made this video to help you fall asleep. Before you do that, please like the video and subscribe. Let me know what time it is with you and where you're watching from in the comments too. Now lay back, relax, and settle in for some chilling stories. I wasn't sure I'd ever talk about this in detail. My family moved to a quiet housing estate just on the outskirts of Cambridge a few years ago, and I thought it'd be a tranquil place to settle. I imagined neat hedgerows, friendly neighbors, and a laid-back suburban lifestyle where you'd greet everyone in the morning before setting off to work. And for a while, that was exactly what we got. My partner Ellis and I bought a semi-detached there, partly because it was close to good schools for our daughter Sophie, who was 7 at the time. We were hoping for a sense of community we never quite found in the city. Things changed though, and I still can't fully wrap my head around it. I'm sharing this here because I've been having nightmares for weeks, and I suspect writing might help purge some of the fear. Our estate had a bizarre undercurrent that none of us noticed at first. I only pieced it all together looking back over the course of a few days that turned our dream of suburbia into a waking horror. It started quietly enough. We'd been invited to a summer barbecue by one of our newer neighbors, a cheerful woman named Teresa. She'd moved in with her husband and teenage son, and she wanted to host a get-together so everyone could meet. The idea was lovely, so on a Saturday afternoon, Ellis and I took Sophie over to their back garden, which overlooked a small communal green. It was a scorchingly hot day, the kind that makes you crave cold drinks and a bit of shade. A few other neighbors came too, families with kids, older couples from the bungalows further down the road. On the surface, it was exactly what I'd always wanted. Friendly chats, kids laughing, the smell of burgers on the grill. Then I met our neighbor across the street, a soft-spoken man named Colin. He lived alone in a rather tidy house, always had pristine flower beds. He was polite, mild-mannered, but something about him put me on edge that day. During the barbecue, he stuck close to me and Ellis, asking odd questions about where we used to live, what brought us here, whether we'd noticed anything unusual at night. We brushed it off at first, thinking he was just being curious, but his questions kept coming. Have you ever woken up around 3 in the morning and heard humming? That was the one that made Ellis exchange a quick glance with me. I laughed it off, said no. Colin just nodded, like he'd expected that answer. A couple of days later, Teresa rang our doorbell in the evening. She looked worried, said someone had knocked on her back window the previous night, but ran off when her husband went to investigate. She asked if we'd had any odd disturbances. I said no, and Ellis shook his head too. We reassured her it was probably kids messing around. There were a few bored teenagers about. But when she left, I felt uneasy. It reminded me of something Sophie had said a few nights before, about hearing tapping at her bedroom window. We'd laughed it off, telling her it was tree branches in the wind or something mundane. 2 nights after that, I was on the sofa working on my laptop. My job in marketing often bleeds into late hours. Ellis and Sophie were asleep. Around midnight, I heard a noise outside like a distant thud. I paused, listening. Then it came again, from near the front gate. I peeked through the curtains, heart fluttering. At first I saw nothing, just the dim outline of parked cars and street lamps glowing. Then a shape moved between 2 bushes across the road, Colin's garden. I squinted, but whoever it was disappeared into the darkness. The next day I told Ellis about it, and he brushed it aside, saying maybe it was a fox, but the pit in my stomach wouldn't fade. I decided to check with Colin next time I saw him. That same afternoon, Sophie came home from her friend's place looking agitated. She said a woman in a gray coat had walked past the garden where Sophie and her friend were playing, and the woman kept staring at her, not saying a word, just staring in this unblinking way. Sophie was spooked enough to come straight home. I tried to calm her, telling her to stay in the back garden next time, or indoors. Yet inside, I felt that creeping sense that something was off around here. After that, little incidents piled up quickly. Another neighbor mentioned seeing footprints in their back garden at dawn. Someone else complained about items vanishing from their washing line. The weird part was that no one was sure who or what was behind it. I caught snatches of conversation about the watchers, but people clammed up if I asked for details. It was as if the estate had an unspoken rule not to delve too deep. One evening, Ellis and I sat down with Sophie after dinner, intending to watch telly before bed. Just as I switched on the set, the power flickered. The lights dimmed, then came back. Sophie laughed nervously. I reached for the remote, but the power went out again, this time for a solid 30 seconds. We sat in darkness, me fumbling for the torch I keep in the side drawer. When the lights returned, I exhaled in relief. I glanced out the window and noticed other houses were dark too. Some sort of mini outage across the estate. We didn't think much of it until the next morning when Teresa texted me, saying her outside fuse box had been tampered with. That set me on edge. I decided to talk to Colin properly. He seemed to know something. He'd hinted as much at the barbecue, so I knocked on his door that afternoon while Sophie was still at school and Ellis was at work. Colin answered, looking weary, dark rings under his eyes, like he hadn't slept. I explained the bizarre events, asked if he had any clue what was happening. He hesitated, then invited me in. We sat in his living room, and he confided that for months he'd been hearing footsteps in his back garden at odd hours. He claimed to have caught a glimpse of someone once, a tall figure crouched behind his shed. When he'd called out, the figure fled. Colin rang the police, but they didn't find any signs of forced entry, and they chalked it up to local youths or prowlers. Then he told me about the humming. He insisted that sometimes around 3 or 4 in the morning, he heard a low hum that seemed to come from outside, like multiple voices chanting in unison but too faint to distinguish words. He tried recording it on his phone, but it never picked up clearly. He suspected a group of people were gathering somewhere on the estate at night. "Have you ever gone out to look?" I asked, half skeptical. He just shook his head, saying he was too afraid. A chill crawled up my spine. I left shortly after, not sure whether to believe him. Over the following days, I kept a wary watch on our windows at night. I had trouble sleeping. I found myself leaning out of bed to listen for footsteps in our garden, or that humming Colin described. Most of the time I heard nothing. But then, around 1:30 one morning, I woke with a jolt. At first I wasn't sure why, until I realized there was a muffled sound somewhere outside. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Ellis, and tiptoed to the window. My heart hammered as I tried to see through the darkness. Sure enough, there was a faint noise, like low, droning voices. I couldn't pinpoint the direction. Before I could investigate further, it stopped. Silence. I stood there for a solid 5 minutes waiting, but it didn't come back. The next day, I wanted to alert the police. Ellis thought I was overreacting. "So there's a weird noise at night. Maybe it's some local group messing around, or some odd construction hum," he said. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was systematically unnerving our community, step by step. Teresa agreed with me. She said her husband had heard similar humming the night before. She suggested we form a little group. Me, Ellis, her husband Gareth, maybe even Colin, and stake out one night to see what was happening. It seemed extreme, but we all felt safer in numbers. We planned it for a Friday when none of us had to work early the next day. Gareth had a small van, so we decided to park it near the main entrance to the estate after midnight, lights off, and wait. That evening, Ellis put Sophie to bed, and we left her with a trusted babysitter, an older lady a few doors down who didn't want to join the stakeout, but agreed to watch Sophie. Then Ellis and I joined Gareth and Teresa in the van around 12:30. We invited Colin, but he declined, saying he was too anxious to be out in the open. I couldn't blame him. We parked under a broken street lamp at the edge of the estate, the van's interior dark. For an hour, nothing happened, just the occasional car passing, random cats skulking about. I started to feel silly, stifling yawns. Then, shortly after 1, we saw movement at the far side of the road, a figure in a long coat, walking with purpose. They headed toward the row of houses near Teresa's. We watched, hearts thumping. The figure paused at the corner, glancing around, then disappeared behind a tall hedge. Gareth turned to us, eyes wide. "Should we follow?" We nodded. He started the van, headlights off, creeping down the street. We found a place to park near the hedge. The figure was gone. Teresa pointed, whispering that the garden behind that hedge was a known shortcut to the communal green. We got out of the van, adrenaline pumping. We made our way silently to the green, clinging to shadows. The moonlight offered just enough visibility to see shapes of benches and the outline of a small playground. Then we heard the humming, low, rhythmic. It sent shivers down my spine. It sounded like multiple voices, but it wasn't exactly chanting words, more like a wordless drone. We followed the sound, each step cautious. My palms were slick with sweat. As we neared a cluster of tall bushes, we peered through a gap. My stomach flipped. A group of 5 or 6 people stood in a small circle, swaying slightly, their heads bowed. They wore dark clothing, some with hoods. The figure in the long coat was among them. In the center of the circle was a small, flickering light, maybe a candle. One of them was tracing shapes on the ground with what looked like chalk. I felt Ellis grip my arm. We couldn't see any faces clearly, just silhouettes under moonlight. The humming continued for another minute. Then one person raised their head, whispered something, and the group broke apart. We ducked back, hearts pounding. The group members spread out, each disappearing into a different corner of the green or slipping into gardens. I was too stunned to do anything. Teresa stifled a gasp. Gareth mouthed, "We need to go." We hurried back to the van, minds reeling, not sure what we'd just witnessed. Some bizarre ritual, a cult, a group of local thrill seekers. It definitely explained the humming, but not the break-ins or the garden prowlers. We drove home in tense silence, each lost in our own thoughts. When Ellis and I returned, the babysitter looked relieved to see us, said Sophie was fine. I peeked in on her, found her sleeping soundly, her nightlight glowing softly. I'd never felt so grateful for normalcy, but I was trembling. We told the babysitter nothing, no reason to scare her. After she left, Ellis and I sat in the living room, heads spinning. We made a plan to phone the police in the morning, though we doubted they'd take us seriously with talk of mysterious chanting figures. The next day, Gareth told us he and Teresa had gone to the station. The officer on duty seemed unimpressed, said they'd send someone to patrol the area, but implied it was probably just a group of local oddballs. That evening, it all escalated. Colin rang my mobile in a panic, saying someone had broken into his shed, rummaged through his gardening tools, then left a strange symbol scrawled on the inside of the door. He wouldn't describe it over the phone, said it was too unsettling. I grabbed Ellis and we rushed over. The shed was cramped, dimly lit by a single torch Colin held. On the door, drawn in black marker, was a crude symbol. 2 interlocking circles with a slash through them. Something about it felt uncomfortably ritualistic. Colin was beside himself, muttering about calling the police again. I urged him to do so, but I could see the futility. They'd show up, take a statement, shrug. I felt powerless. That night was the worst. Around 3, Sophie woke up screaming. Ellis and I bolted into her room, found her crying, pointing at the window. She kept saying she saw someone peering in, even though we're on the first floor. There was no ledge. I tried to calm her, turned on the light, showed her there was no one there. But I saw faint smudges on the glass, like handprints. My blood went cold. We brought her into our bedroom, locked all the windows, double-checked every door. None of us slept. The next morning, I texted Teresa and Gareth that we needed to get serious help. They agreed. We phoned the police, demanded they come round. 2 officers arrived, took statements from multiple neighbors. They looked around the estate, found traces of chalk near the green, plus some footprints that might have matched the rummaging in back gardens. But they had no leads, no suspect names, nothing. The estate's residents grew more frightened by the hour. Kids stopped playing outside. We all locked up early, curtains drawn before sundown. That evening, something unexpected happened. A council official in a high-vis vest showed up with a small team, saying they had instructions to repair broken street lamps around the estate and check the communal green for safety hazards. We were relieved, thinking maybe the authorities were finally taking it seriously. But as they worked, I caught glimpses of the official speaking with certain neighbors in hushed tones, as if he knew them personally. A knot of suspicion twisted in my gut. By the time the sun set, they'd supposedly finished their checks and left. That night, the estate was eerily quiet. Ellis and I stayed up late, uneasy, listening for footsteps, humming, anything. At around 1, I heard a single car door slam outside. I peered from the upstairs window and saw the council official's van with two men in high-vis gear standing beside it. They scanned the dark houses, then walked off down the street. I wanted to wake Ellis and go after them, but fear rooted me in place. Something about their posture felt predatory, not the confident stride of workers, but the furtive steps of people up to no good. 15 minutes later, I heard a commotion near the communal green. I shook Ellis awake, and we decided we had to do something. We grabbed our torches, creeping out of the house. Gareth and Teresa were already outside, half whispering, half calling our names. They'd heard the noise too. Together, we tiptoed toward the green, hearts pounding. We spotted multiple figures gathered again, but this time, they were carrying flashlights rather than a candle. The beams darted around as if searching for something. Suddenly, a bright flashlight swept our way, catching us in its beam. We froze. One of the men barked, "Who's there?" Before we could speak, Gareth shouted, "We've called the police." It was a bluff. He just hoped to scare them off. Instead, half the group took off running, while 2 or 3 advanced on us, torches blinding our vision. My pulse hammered. In the glare, I recognized the same high-vis vest from earlier. The so-called council official. He hissed, "You lot shouldn't be meddling." It was then we saw something truly chilling. Near their feet lay a folded tarp, under which were items that looked disturbingly personal. Children's toys, a small teddy, a handful of keys, a single trainer. The man kicked the tarp aside to hide them better. I blurted out, "What are you doing with those things?" He ignored me, motioned to one of his associates. I had a fleeting terror that they'd chase us or hurt us. Gareth raised his phone, snapping a picture with the flash on. One of them lunged, trying to grab the phone, but Gareth ducked away. Teresa screamed for help. Lights flicked on in nearby houses. The men hesitated, presumably not wanting a confrontation with the entire estate watching. In that moment, a voice shouted from behind them, "Police! Stay where you are!" I don't know if it was truly the police or a neighbor faking it, but it worked. The men bolted, the high-vis official cursing under his breath. We heard their footsteps pounding away into the night. Adrenaline coursed through me so hard I thought my knees would give out. Other residents emerged, some in dressing gowns, some wielding torches and phones. Someone really had rung the police this time, because about 10 minutes later, a patrol car arrived. We showed them the scattered items under the tarp, bits of stolen possessions from multiple houses, including, heartbreakingly, a teddy belonging to a missing cat. I spotted a plastic hair bauble that looked like Sophie's. My heart seized. The officers took statements, shining bright beams around the green, but the intruders were long gone. There were footprints, scraps of packaging, and that symbol again drawn in chalk on a bench. Over the next 2 days, more police presence arrived, as the burglary angle was now clear. They suspected a group was systematically pilfering items from gardens, possibly houses, then using the estate's layout to hide. But that didn't explain the chanting, the strange symbols, or the sense of something more sinister. Some of us theorized it was a cover, like they used these creepy rituals to scare residents into staying indoors, making it easier to prowl about. Others insisted there was a genuine cult element, that they were performing odd ceremonies for reasons we'd never understand. All I know is that after the police made several arrests, apparently they caught a couple of the men in a nearby industrial estate, our nights became quieter. I don't have all the details, but from what we gathered, a ringleader was still at large. Some of the items stolen from us were recovered, though not all. Even so, the prowling, the handprints on Sophie's window, the symbolic markings in people's sheds, all of it stopped. It was as if an entire lurking presence had been driven away. The police insisted it was an organized burglary ring that used intimidation tactics. But part of me wonders if there was more to it, a cult-like ritual or bizarre belief system that they used to unify themselves. It's been several months now. The estate's tried to move on, holding normal barbecues, community get-togethers, that sort of thing. We got motion sensor lights installed around the neighborhood, security cameras too. Sophie still won't sleep with her curtains open, and to be honest, I don't blame her. I keep having dreams of that circle of figures, humming in the moonlight. Sometimes I wake up convinced I can hear it again. Ellis says it's just paranoia, but I see the tension in his face too whenever he hears a bump in the night. Colin has put his house on the market, planning to leave. Teresa and Gareth are staying but have become hyper-vigilant. We have a local WhatsApp group now, where we check in with each other if anything suspicious happens. It's sad that we had to jump straight to security measures, but that's what it took to feel even slightly safe again. I'm telling this story because I've realized suburban life can be just as scary as any big city. The illusions of safety behind trimmed lawns and neat footpaths can shatter in an instant. Sometimes, strange groups or criminals use quiet estates to hide in plain sight, counting on people's reluctance to suspect anything unusual. And when you do start noticing, it can feel like you're paranoid or overreacting, until it's too late. I still don't know if the chanting was purely for intimidation, or if they believed in something darker. The chalk symbols, the stolen possessions, the parted curtains in the middle of the night. None of it fully lines up into a neat explanation. But I know how it felt, like we were pawns in a scheme we never understood, manipulated by fear. I'm just grateful that the police intervention and the community banding together put a stop to it before anyone was seriously harmed. Sophie's recovered well, though she still asks sometimes, why did they want my things? I don't have a good answer. I usually say it was a few bad people who wanted to scare us, but we're safe now. And that's mostly true. The nightmares might never entirely fade for me, though. Every so often, I wake in the early hours, listening for that hum, half convinced I'll see a figure by the shed or a shape pressed to Sophie's window. I keep telling myself we've moved on, that the estate is normal now. Most nights I believe it. But I'll never again see quiet suburban life as automatically safe. Under the neat facades, who knows what might be lurking. I don't usually travel much, especially not alone, but I ended up in a peculiar situation when my sister insisted I join her wedding preparation meeting in a fancy hotel out in Cornwall. As it happened, my sister's fiance came down with a terrible cold right before, so it was just me making the trip. I was annoyed, knackered from a grueling month at the office, but I knew how important this was to her. She'd booked us both into this historic seaside hotel, which looked charming in the photos, stone facade, old-fashioned balconies overlooking the waves. A perfect wedding venue, she'd gushed. Well, that first day, everything fell apart. A massive storm hit the region out of nowhere, strong enough to knock out part of the local power grid. By the time I arrived, the hotel was running off a backup generator for essential lights and minimal heating. No lifts, no Wi-Fi, barely any signal on my phone. The lobby was lit by flickering bulbs, the old chandelier overhead half dead. It gave the place an eerie vibe. What was meant to be cozy suddenly felt oppressive. I checked in, though the receptionist seemed distracted, glancing nervously at the thunder outside. She muttered that some staff had gone home because of the weather, leaving just a skeleton crew. I made my way to my first-floor room, lugging my suitcase up the grand staircase, which was shrouded in near darkness. My phone had about 30% battery left and no service. Typical. I told myself I'd just rest, help my sister with planning in the morning, and hope the power was restored soon. That night, I lay in bed listening to the wind lash at the windows. The hotel creaked alarmingly, as if it were old bones protesting the storm. I drifted into a fitful sleep, only to wake with a start when the lights flickered. I glanced at the old clock on the bedside table. It was nearly 1 in the morning. That's when I heard footsteps in the corridor, slow, deliberate, like someone pacing back and forth. Usually I'd dismiss it. Other guests can wander around at any hour. But something about it raised the hairs on my arms. The footsteps sounded almost too measured, like a deliberate pattern. I waited, tension coiling in my gut. Eventually, the footsteps stopped outside my door. A soft knock followed. I froze. Who would be knocking at this hour? Yes? I called quietly. No reply, just a faint shuffle, a second knock. I climbed out of bed, heart racing, tiptoed to the door. Hello? Still no answer. I peered through the peephole, but the corridor was so dark I saw only vague shapes. Another quiet shuffle, then the footsteps retreated. I exhaled, relieved and unsettled. Maybe it was another guest. half lost in the corridors, or a member of staff checking something. Still, it felt wrong. The next morning, the generator was still all we had. The storm hadn't eased. Rain battered the windows. The promised wedding planner never arrived. Apparently the roads were blocked. My sister texted that she couldn't make it either because her fiancé was too ill to drive and trains had been canceled. I was marooned here, alone in a half-powered hotel that reeked of damp carpets and old sea salt. I considered leaving, but the staff said no buses or taxis were running until the weather improved. I'd driven, but the roads were apparently flooded out of town, so I had no choice but to stay put. I tried to make the most of it, roamed the dim hallways, admired the antique decor. I bumped into a handful of other guests, mostly older folks who looked as miserable as me. The staff were polite but scarce, and the receptionist told me they were down to half the usual employees. I asked if anyone else had reported strange knocks in the night, and she blinked at me. "Not that I'm aware of," she said. As night approached again, the storm only worsened. The lounge was cold, lit by a couple of emergency lamps. I decided to have a drink in the bar, which was manned by a bored-looking barman who told me they were short on supplies now. Just my luck. After a lukewarm beer, I headed upstairs, planning to read by torchlight until I dozed off. The corridor to my room felt even darker than before. I clicked on my phone's torch, picking out the old patterned wallpaper and a row of closed doors. Ahead, I glimpsed a shape that made my pulse jolt. A figure standing outside a room, leaning forward as if listening at the door. I paused, uncertain if it was a guest. "Hello?" I ventured. The figure stood upright, turned to look my way, though I could barely make out features in the gloom. Then they glided, into a nearby side corridor. I swallowed hard, adrenaline spiking. Something about that movement wasn't right. It wasn't frantic or even hurried, more like a silent retreat. I crept forward, shining my torch around the corner, but the figure was gone. My heart hammered. Maybe a staff member? But why hide? I locked myself in my room, breathing shakily. The wind howled outside, rattling the window. I sat on the edge of the bed, reminding myself I was just spooked because of the flickering lights and the isolation. Yet my mind wouldn't settle. Eventually, I slid under the covers, hoping exhaustion would knock me out. Sometime after midnight, the flickering overhead bulb died completely, and I was left in total darkness. Then the footsteps came again, that same measured tread, back and forth. I lay rigid, heart thudding in my ears. Another soft knock, but this time it wasn't at my door. It sounded further down. I strained to listen. Knock, knock, then footsteps, then silence. 5 minutes passed. A second pair of footsteps joined the corridor, a low murmur of voices. I clutched my phone, debating whether to investigate or call for help. But there was no signal, and I doubted the front desk had a direct line. I gathered my courage, flicked on my phone torch, and eased the door open. The corridor was nearly pitch black. The emergency lamps must have gone out or run low. Down the hall, I saw two silhouettes facing each other. One whispered urgently, but I couldn't catch the words. Then one turned and noticed me. I froze. They swiftly parted ways. One disappeared round a corner, the other retreated to a stairwell. My heart hammered so loudly I thought I might faint. I forced myself to walk towards the corner, phone torch quivering in my hand. When I turned that corner, I nearly stumbled over something on the floor. My light revealed a battered suitcase, half open, clothes spilling out. I recognized it from the lobby earlier. It belonged to an older couple I'd seen checking in. Why was it here, in the middle of the corridor? I looked around anxiously, calling out, "Hello, is anyone here?" No response. I checked the nearest doors, all locked. The suitcase was abandoned. Fear churned in my gut. Had someone forced them to leave it behind, or stolen it? I hurried downstairs to the front desk, but no one was there. I rang the little bell, waited, but the place was empty. The lounge lights flickered ominously. I considered going into the staff-only areas, but a sign warned, "Authorized personnel only." I didn't care. I was desperate. I pushed through anyway and found a narrow corridor lined with supply cupboards. My phone torch picked out piles of towels, cleaning fluids, that sort of thing. Then I heard a voice behind me. "Excuse me, this area is off limits." I spun around, nearly dropping my phone. A tall man in a dark suit stood there, not wearing any visible name tag. He had a neutral expression, though his eyes were cold. "I'm trying to report something odd," I said breathlessly. "There are people wandering the corridors at night, and someone abandoned a suitcase upstairs." He held up a hand. "We're aware of the situation. Please return to your room." I stared at him, baffled. "Aware? What do you mean? Where is everyone?" He repeated, almost mechanically. "Return to your room. We've got it under control." A surge of anger replaced my fear. "No, I want answers. Who are you?" He gave a slight tilt of his head, as though deciding how to respond. Before he could speak, the overhead lights flickered back on briefly, revealing that his suit was frayed at the edges, like it didn't quite fit him. In that split second, I noticed something else. The name tag pinned to his lapel was a cheap plastic card, the name smudged or erased. He pressed his lips together and said, "Maintenance staff," in a clipped tone. I was about to argue when he stepped forward and intimidation rolled off him in waves. Instinct told me to back away. I retreated into the corridor, half turning to keep him in view, then hurried towards the lobby. When I glanced over my shoulder, he wasn't following. But I was done. I had to get out of here, storm or not. I grabbed my coat from my room, stuffed essentials into my backpack, and headed downstairs, determined to attempt driving away. The roads might be flooded, but I'd rather be stuck in my car than in this creepy place. In the lobby, I found a middle-aged woman with tears in her eyes, rummaging in her handbag, clearly distressed. "They took my husband," she whispered when she saw me. "He went to ask about the power and he never came back." Fear clenched my chest. "What do you mean, took him?" She shook her head, trembling. "A man told me he'd left the hotel, but his phone and wallet are still here." I told her we should try to leave together. She nodded fervently. We rushed to the main doors, but outside the wind was ferocious, rain lashing sideways. The woman started crying, saying she couldn't drive in those conditions. She had no idea which roads were even open. I checked the corridor behind us, expecting that tall man to appear. He didn't. In a desperate move, I said, "Let's try to find the real manager or a staff member we can trust." She agreed. We ventured into a lounge area off to the side. It was dim, a single lamp on. Behind a desk, rummaging in a file cabinet, stood a young employee I recognized from earlier. She'd served me breakfast. She looked up, startled to see us. The woman next to me blurted out her story, tears streaming. The employee frowned. "I'm the only one here right now," she said, voice quivering. "The manager left hours ago to get more supplies." "Who did you speak to?" "We don't have a tall man in a suit on staff." My blood ran cold. I described him, and she shook her head vehemently. "No one matching that description works here." Panic seized me. "He said he was maintenance or something." She cut me off. "Maintenance is two older blokes, definitely not tall or wearing a suit. We've had strangers around. The storm caused chaos and the phone lines are mostly down." She bit her lip. "I suspect a couple of opportunistic people snuck in. With the power down, it's easy to slip around unnoticed." My mind reeled. "Do you think they're kidnapping people? Or robbing them?" She looked as terrified as we were. "I'm not sure, but I've seen them lurking in corridors, trying master keys in some doors." That was enough for me. "We have to get out, or at least barricade ourselves somewhere safe," I said. The woman clung to my arm. "My husband, he might still be here," she insisted. I told her we'd search the ground floor quickly, though dread gnawed at me. We split up. The staff member went to check the back offices. I took the sobbing woman to the dining room, scanning for any sign of her husband or these intruders. The dining room was empty, chairs stacked, the smell of stale bread lingering. Rain pounded the windows so fiercely I feared they'd shatter. In the gloom, I spotted a second exit door. Could her husband have gone out that way? Suddenly, footsteps approached. I signaled for the woman to stay quiet. We ducked behind an upturned table. A shadow passed across the doorway. My heartbeat thundered. Then we heard a low voice. "She's not in her room. The corridor's clear. Search the lounge." Another voice murmured a reply, and they moved on. Terrified, we crawled to the exit door and tried it. It opened into a side alley buffeted by howling wind. The woman balked at stepping outside. "We might get lost in the storm," she whispered, but staying put seemed suicidal. We decided to attempt it, hoping we'd find a path around to the car park. The wind nearly knocked us over. Rain stung my skin like needles. We clung to the alley wall, inching forward. Lightning flashed, illuminating the swirling torrent of water flooding the alley. The woman shouted her husband's name, voice swallowed by the wind. I grabbed her hand, urging her to move. A flash of movement made me freeze. Someone stood at the far end of the alley, blocking the way. I recognized that tall frame, the too big suit. In the flicker of lightning, his face was blank, eyes fixed on us. My companion let out a guttural scream. We spun, heading back towards the dining room door, but it slammed shut, locked from inside. We pounded on it in vain, the handle not budging. Lightning lit the alley again, revealing he was now striding towards us. I felt panic claw at my throat. The woman fumbled at the door, sobbing. We had nowhere to go but deeper into the alley. We splashed through ankle-deep water, the fierce wind nearly throwing us off balance. I glanced over my shoulder. He was following, steady, unstoppable. Then to our left, I noticed a side gate. It was half broken, leading into a courtyard behind the hotel. We forced it open, the wood scraping. In the courtyard, we found a set of stone steps leading to a cellar door. It looked locked, but we had no choice. We tugged at it desperately. Miraculously, it gave way, the old lock snapping under our combined weight. We stumbled in, slamming the door behind us. Inside was pitch black, a damp smell of mold. We pressed our ears to the door, listening for footsteps. The storm raged overhead, muffling everything. For a few agonizing minutes, we heard nothing but thunder and the woman's ragged breathing. Finally, we dared to switch on my phone torch. The cellar was cramped, filled with dusty crates, old cleaning supplies, a battered old staff uniform. We found a rickety table and shoved it against the door to form a makeshift barricade. All we could do was wait, nerves frayed. The woman whispered her husband's name, tears in her voice. I tried to comfort her, though I felt as helpless as she did. My phone battery was down to 10%. I considered calling 999, but there was no signal. Minutes dragged into an hour, maybe more. The storm roared on, water trickling through cracks in the ceiling. My feet were numb, clothes soaked. At some point, my companion dozed off, exhaustion taking over. I stayed awake, leaning against the crates. Then I heard movement above, the scrape of chairs or tables. A door slammed. My heart lurched. I killed the torch, staying silent. Something heavy clunked over the floor above us. Then a voice drifted down, muffled, but definitely that same low tone. "Search the cellar." I shot upright. The woman woke, panic flaring in her eyes. We held our breath. Footsteps approached the cellar door. The handle rattled. I stifled a scream, pressing myself against the wall. A tremendous thud as someone tried to kick it in. The table shuddered but held. Another kick, the wood splintering. I was certain we were finished. Suddenly, outside, we heard shouting. Multiple voices. Another door banged from somewhere else in the courtyard. Then more shouting, and unbelievably, we heard a siren. "Police?" The thudding on the cellar door ceased. Footsteps retreated, pounding away. My entire body shook with relief. We waited petrified for a few more minutes until a new voice called down, "Police, anyone there?" We tore away the table, flung open the door. The wind whipped in, but we saw uniformed officers in the courtyard, torches cutting through the darkness. They let us out, supporting the woman who was sobbing uncontrollably. I babbled about intruders in the hotel, a tall man in a suit. They guided us through the building where more officers moved about, shining lights into corridors. The battered suitcase lay in the hall. The older couple eventually emerged from a different corner of the hotel, clearly shaken but unharmed. It turned out the manager had managed to alert the police from another location once she realized something was off. Several suspicious individuals fled as soon as law enforcement arrived, though they managed to apprehend at least one near the lobby. The tall man apparently escaped, leaving behind a stolen staff card and a bag stuffed with valuables from guests' rooms. No sign of the woman's husband, though. She was hysterical until, thank God, one of the officers found him locked in a storage cupboard upstairs, alive but battered. He'd been ambushed when he went to ask about the power. The police suspect these people took advantage of the storm-induced blackout to infiltrate the hotel, possibly to rob guests or force them to relinquish credit cards, valuables, who knows. The eerie footsteps, the knocks at odd hours, the sabotage. It was all part of a plan to frighten and isolate us, maybe push us to flee so they could loot our rooms. I've no idea how far it might have gone if the police hadn't intervened. By dawn, the storm finally began to ease. The roads were still flooded, but rescue services were out in force. The hotel lost a handful of guests overnight. Some left in terror or were relocated by the police. I gave my statement, recounting everything from the corridor encounters to the chase in the alley. My sister called frantically when phone lines returned, apologizing for sending me into that mess. I still have nightmares about those measured footsteps outside my door, the knock that came with no voice behind it. Even though the police explained a plausible motive, organized theft under the guise of staff, I can't shake the feeling that the tall man's eyes were almost empty, as though he was wearing someone else's face. That might just be my fear talking, but it doesn't help me sleep at night. I left the hotel as soon as I could, wading through shallow floodwater to reach my car, not caring if it got damaged. I wanted as much distance between me and that place as possible. My sister ended up choosing a completely different venue for her wedding, thank goodness. I still wonder how many of those intruders were arrested, or if some are still out there, waiting for the next storm or blackout to slip in and prey on unsuspecting guests. I guess the lesson is that sometimes the scariest threats aren't from ghosts or legends, but from real people who exploit our vulnerabilities. I never got the tall man's name, or any closure about his bizarre composure, but that's how reality goes. Messy, incomplete, and terrifying. All I know is that I'll never stay in a half-powered old hotel again, and I'll forever be wary of footsteps in a dark corridor. It's a shame, because I used to love the sound of storms. Now thunder only reminds me of that dreadful place and the night I nearly disappeared into its shadows. I keep telling myself I've moved past the guilt, that the tragedy in the forest happened long ago, but sometimes the memories flood back with startling clarity. I'm sharing it because, for the first time in ages, I'm considering returning to that campsite, a place I once vowed never to set foot in again. This is my way of processing the fear. 5 years ago, I was on a weekend camping trip with my best mate, Layla, and a few other friends. We were an inseparable group back then, bonded by silly inside jokes and a love of the outdoors. We chose a remote spot in Dartmoor, far from the typical tourist paths. It was meant to be our last hurrah before adult life swept us into separate corners. New jobs, mortgages, engagements. At first it was lovely. Starry skies, campfire laughter, sharing stories in our tents until late. Then a sudden thunderstorm rolled in on the second night. It came out of nowhere, fierce and unrelenting, turning the campsite into a swamp of mud and toppled tents. We panicked, trying to gather our gear. In the chaos, lightning struck a nearby tree, sending shards of splintered wood raining down. One piece struck Matt, our friend, in the leg, a deep cut that bled horribly. Another struck Layla's arm. I remember the flash of fear in her eyes as we all scrambled for cover. We tried to call for help, but there was no phone signal in that area. Rain hammered down, thunder rattling our bones. We had no choice but to carry the injured to the nearest road. The group split, me and Layla forging ahead, while 2 others supported Matt behind us. We planned to meet at the car, about half an hour's hike. The storm roared, mud sucking at our boots. At some point I lost Layla in the gloom. I'd been walking just ahead, shining a torch. I turned around and she was gone. I shouted, retraced my steps, but the downpour drowned my voice. Matt and the others caught up, frantic. We searched for what felt like an eternity, calling her name. At last we found her unconscious at the bottom of a small ravine, probably slipped on wet ground. We scrambled down, calling out to her, but she wasn't breathing. I'm not going into graphic details. Just know we tried CPR for ages. By the time emergency services arrived, it took them nearly 2 hours to get a signal and find us. It was too late. My best friend died that night, and I've carried survivor's guilt ever since. Part of me thinks if I'd kept closer watch, if I'd stuck by her side, Maybe she'd still be here. That sense of responsibility gnawed at me for years. The campsite closed a season later due to safety concerns. I haven't been near Dartmoor since, but earlier this month, I heard the site reopened under new management, with improved facilities. Something in me snapped. I felt an urge to confront the place. Maybe it's time to face the memories. So I convinced one friend, Darren, to join me. He was part of the group that night. We'd go for just one day, no overnight stay, to pay our respects. Darren was reluctant at first, but agreed, saying maybe it would bring closure. We drove up on a clear Saturday morning, the sky bright. My stomach churned with anxious energy as we neared the old campsite. So many flashbacks of that stormy night battered my mind. Darren kept quiet, eyes fixed on the road. When we arrived, it was eerily peaceful. A scattering of new tents, a refurbished lodge. We showed a volunteer our day pass, then walked to the area where we once pitched our tents. The ground was drier than I remembered, the grass lush. I tried to picture the fallen tree, the mud, the lightning's flash. My heart pounded. We spent a while wandering, pointing out spots where we'd set up tents or built campfires. Eventually, we found the ravine. The new staff had placed a wooden fence around it, presumably for safety. Darren and I stood there, both lost in thought. I whispered a goodbye to Layla, tears stinging my eyes. We placed a small bunch of wildflowers at the fence post, turned to go. That's when I spotted a figure among the trees. A tall, lanky man wearing a jacket with the hood up. He was watching us. I told Darren, who shrugged. Probably another camper, he said. But the man's stare felt invasive, unwavering. We decided to move on, exploring further. Every now and then I glimpsed that figure in my peripheral vision, ducking behind a tree or crouching in the brush. My skin prickled with unease. Darren noticed too, muttering that we should head back. Then, as we turned onto a narrower trail near the forest edge, we came across an odd shrine-like arrangement on the ground. A small circle of stones, pine cones laid out in a pattern. In the center was a battered photograph of a woman, water-stained, pinned down by a rock. My stomach twisted. Who would leave that here and why? Darren gently picked up the photo to see if there was any writing on the back. No luck. Just blank. He set it down again. We heard a twig snap. The hooded man stepped out from behind a large pine, startling us. Up close, his face was partially hidden in the shadow of the hood, but I saw intense eyes. He spoke in a low, raspy voice. "That's not for you to touch." Darren stammered an apology, saying we didn't mean to disturb anything. The man looked from me to Darren, then down at the photograph. "Leave an offering, or the spirits remain restless," he muttered. A chill rippled through me. I asked if he worked here, but he ignored the question, repeating, "Leave an offering." We exchanged a wary glance. Darren took a small wood carving from his rucksack, he's into whittling, and set it by the stones, hoping to appease the man. The hooded stranger nodded, then turned away, disappearing into the forest. We breathed out relief. Darren wanted to get back to the lodge. We retraced our steps, but the forest suddenly felt more confusing than before. Maybe we took a wrong turn, or maybe we were just rattled, but soon we found ourselves in a part of the woods we didn't recognize. Worse still, we noticed our phone signals had dropped to nothing, typical in remote Dartmoor. My pulse quickened. Flashbacks of the stormy night overwhelmed me. We wandered for what felt like an hour, trying not to panic. Birds chirped overhead, the sun filtering through branches. It was the opposite of that thunderous chaos from years ago, but still unnerving. Occasionally, I thought I saw the hooded man in the distance, slipping behind a tree. Once I heard footsteps, but when we turned to look, no one was there. Darren clung to a map he'd got from the lodge, but it didn't seem to match the trails we were on. At one point, we found another bizarre arrangement of stones, with a worn teddy bear in the middle. The repeated motif unsettled me. Finally, we stumbled onto a faint path that led to the ravine again, where we'd left flowers for Layla. Relief flooded me. At least we knew the way from here. But as we approached the fence, we realized our flowers were gone. In their place, lay a small twig figure bound with twine, something you'd see in a folk horror film. My heart thudded. Darren looked pale. "This is messed up," he whispered. We hurried back to the main campsite. The lodge was in sight, and I nearly wept with relief. A staff member, a middle-aged woman, came out. We told her about the hooded man, the weird shrines, our vanished flowers. She frowned, saying a few campers had reported seeing someone rummaging about, leaving odd objects. They'd guessed he was a local who had some personal rituals or maybe mental health issues. "We've alerted the rangers," she said, "but so far, they haven't found him." She apologized for our distress, offering us tea in the lodge. Darren and I sat there, trembling slightly, sipping hot drinks, recounting the bizarre events. That's when he said quietly, "Maybe we should leave something more for Layla, something that can't be taken." I knew what he meant. We decided to carve her initials into a sturdy piece of wood on the fence, just a small memorial that the stranger couldn't easily remove. The staff woman allowed it, even gave us a small carving knife. So, in the afternoon sun, we returned to the fence. We kept glancing over our shoulders, half expecting the hooded man to appear. Darren carved LD neatly into the wood. I felt tears welling up again, but I also felt calmer, like we'd taken back some agency. Then, to our left, a branch cracked. The hooded man emerged from behind a thick oak, face hidden. He didn't speak, just stood there. I mustered courage. "We're not disturbing anything, we're honoring our friend," I called, voice shaking. The man remained silent. Darren finished the carving. We turned to leave, and the man let out a low exhale, almost like a sigh. It sounded sad in a way. Then he disappeared behind the tree. Back at the lodge, we gathered our things, intent on heading home. On the drive out, Darren was tense, checking the rear-view mirror. I stared out the window, my mind swirling with grief for Layla and confusion about the stranger. Maybe he was just a wanderer with a fixation on shrines, but it felt symbolic, like the forest itself was a place of mourning for more than just us. A week later, I received a parcel in the post with no return address. Inside was a small twig figure bound with twine, identical to the one we'd seen, except this one had tiny initials carved into it. LD. I nearly dropped it in shock. Darren told me he got a similar one. Neither of us knows how the stranger found our addresses, or if it was him at all. Maybe a staff prank, though that seems twisted. We decided not to dwell on it, stashing the figures away. I still don't understand what that man was doing, or why he left us an effigy of Layla's initials. Was it a gesture of respect? A warning? All I know is that I no longer dream of that thunderous night the same way. Now I sometimes see a hooded figure standing in the lightning, beckoning me deeper into the forest. I wake up sweating, uncertain if it's a memory or a nightmare. Part of me thinks the forest is just the forest. Beautiful, indifferent, occasionally deadly. Another part imagines it harbors secrets, watchers who keep track of tragedies like Layla's. Perhaps the hooded man was one such sentinel, or maybe he just latched onto our sorrow for reasons known only to him. Does it matter? We survived, but we carry scars. I'll always blame myself for losing sight of Layla in that storm, whether it was truly my fault or not. I'm not sure if I'll go back again. Darren says he's done. He got the closure he needed. For me, it's more complicated. The forest now symbolizes both heartbreak and mystery. A place that took my friend's life but also offered a strange sense of connection. Like there's more to this land than we'll ever comprehend. Whenever I see the twig figure hidden away in a drawer, I feel a mixture of dread and comfort. Dread at the unknown, comfort that maybe in some inexplicable way, Layla's memory is honored there. I guess that's the real horror. Not a jump scare or a violent threat, but the slow, gnawing knowledge that sometimes you can't fully move on from a tragedy. The environment that claimed someone you loved can become a magnet for all sorts of inexplicable experiences, layering regret and curiosity into an unholy mix. Maybe that's how I'll carry Layla forward, by acknowledging that some questions have no neat answers, and some regrets never fade. Still, I can't deny that hush of dread that settles in my chest when I think of the hooded figure. Did he watch us from the undergrowth 5 years ago too? Could he have saved Layla if he'd intervened? These thoughts keep me up, swirling with guilt and what-ifs. But life goes on. I'll continue telling myself that the forest is just a forest, despite the signs of something else at play. Maybe someday I'll find the courage to return alone, place the twig figure with her initials by that fence, and see if the hooded man appears one last time, an ending or a beginning. I'm not sure which. For now, I'll keep remembering Layla's laughter around the campfire, and I'll remind myself that the storm was what took her life, not me. That's the only way I cope. And if that's not enough, well, at least I have these words, typed out in the hope of making sense of the senseless, if only for a moment. I thought going on a cruise in the middle of autumn was a brilliant idea, a bit less crowded, a bit cheaper, and still plenty of time to enjoy the sea air. My older sister Caroline had recently recovered from a knee operation, and she suggested we treat ourselves to a proper holiday. Since I'd just managed to scrape together a bit of disposable income after months of saving, I agreed. We booked a 7-day voyage around the Mediterranean, complete with onboard entertainment, buffets, and late-night shows. We were excited, imagining lazy days by the pool, sipping cocktails, forgetting about the chill back in Britain. The ship was massive, 15 decks, multiple restaurants, and a theater. It was my first cruise ever, and I was giddy at the sight of that gleaming white behemoth in the harbor. We departed from Barcelona under sunny skies, feeling the warmth of the Mediterranean brushing our faces as we leaned over the railing. Caroline used a walking stick due to her knee still acting up, but she was in good spirits. We made a pact to explore as much of the ship as we could from top to bottom. "If you see me lagging behind, just toss me an encouraging grin," she said, and I happily agreed. On our second night at sea, we sat out on the top deck, watching a cheesy stage production. The ship's performers were going through the motions of a half-hearted Broadway medley. Suddenly, there was a flicker of the stage lights and everything went dark. People gasped. A second later, the lights flicked back on. The cruise director made a wry joke about never trusting the electrics on the open sea. Everyone laughed it off. The next day, though, we heard rumors that the ship's main generator was experiencing periodic failures. Crew members hurried around, checking compartments, taking notes, whispering amongst themselves. I tried not to worry. We were in the middle of the Mediterranean. There must be backup systems, I reasoned. Still, Caroline and I both noticed that the atmosphere felt tense. Some of the staff looked anxious, and the captain's announcements were oddly vague, just promises that all systems are functioning normally. That evening, I was up on deck 10, grabbing a soft drink from one of the open-air bars, when I noticed an officer, someone high-ranking, judging by his epaulets, speaking in hushed tones to a colleague. He looked over at me, paused, then resumed his whispering. My stomach tightened. Normally I'd ignore that, but something about his demeanor rattled me. The friendlier staff were always happy to chat with passengers, but this was different. It felt like they were hiding something urgent. At around 9:30, Caroline and I were strolling through the promenade area, a sort of indoor street lined with shops, when without warning, the lights went out, pitch black, apart from the faint glow of emergency lights near the floor. People cried out, startled. Then a second or two later, the overhead lights came back, flickered, and died again. This time it stayed dark. A few people turned on torches from their phones, but those lights revealed worried faces. Something was very wrong. A voice crackled over the ship's loudspeaker, sounding uncertain. "We appear to be experiencing a major electrical fault. Please remain calm. Crew will guide you to safe areas." The speaker cut off, fizzing into silence. I gripped Caroline's arm. She'd gone rigid with fear. She hates darkness. She had a nasty fall once at home when the power went out unexpectedly. "Stay close to me," I told her. "We'll find somewhere with backup lighting." But there was no phone signal. I tried my mobile, nothing. That was normal at sea, but we'd at least expected to use the ship's Wi-Fi. Of course, with the power out, the Wi-Fi was gone. We were effectively cut off. We joined a small group of confused passengers, many shining phone torches around the promenade. A young woman in a crew uniform approached, voice trembling. "Please make your way to the main atrium. We have emergency lighting there." We asked about the cause of the outage, but she just shook her head, biting her lip. Down in the atrium, this grand multi-level space with a sweeping staircase, dim emergency lights glowed, enough to see maybe a dozen crew members huddled, all looking equally worried. The captain was nowhere in sight. A tall man with an officer's uniform stepped forward, introduced himself as Chief Officer Clark, and told us to remain patient. "We're switching to backup systems. There's no danger," he insisted, though I could see sweat beading on his forehead. Caroline nudged me, whispering, "He looks terrified." She was right. Clark's eyes flicked about as though he expected chaos any minute. Someone demanded to know if we should head for the lifeboats. Clark dismissed that, telling us the ship was stable, no reason to panic. But the tension in the air grew. By that time, more passengers flooded into the atrium, so at least we weren't alone. We spent what felt like an hour there, uncertain, listening to frightened murmurs. Without power, the air conditioning started failing, and the temperature inside rose. Some people complained of feeling faint. Crew members distributed bottled water, but it wasn't nearly enough for everyone. Through the large windows, I could see the sea pitch black, the horizon indistinguishable from the sky. We were drifting, I realized, because the engines had died along with the power. At one point, I noticed a man in uniform stepping away from the group, heading towards the restricted crew corridors. He had a stern expression, his posture rigid with authority. I recognized him from earlier, the officer who'd been whispering in hushed tones. Something about him made me uneasy, so I followed at a distance, telling Caroline I'd be right back. She grabbed my arm, but I assured her I just wanted to find out more. "Wait here. Be safe," I said, and slipped into the corridor before she could protest. The corridors were dimly lit by emergency strips on the floor, casting everything in a ghostly glow. At each turn, I expected a crew member to yell at me to return to the public area, but no one appeared. I kept going until I found the man standing near a locked maintenance door, speaking quietly into a handheld radio. I crouched behind a corner, listening. "They're complaining about total engine failure," he said, voice tight. "But the backups should have kicked in. If we can't keep the passengers calm..." He trailed off. A crackle of static, then an inaudible reply. He responded, "I've done everything I can. No one else knows yet." My heart hammered. Everything about his tone suggested he was in a position of trust, but was concealing crucial information. Then he turned, and I darted back, pressing against the wall. He moved off, footsteps echoing. Once he was gone, I took a shaky breath. So they were hiding a full engine failure from us. That explained the drifting, but what was the real cause of the power collapse? Could it be sabotage? A horrifying thought flickered through my mind. What if this man was behind it? I tried to steady myself. I wasn't going to jump to wild conclusions. Yet my gut screamed that something deliberate was happening. I snuck back to Caroline, who was huddled with other passengers. They'd organized a sort of queue for water and blankets, as it was starting to get both stuffy and eerily cold in different areas of the ship. I pulled her aside, whispered what I'd overheard. She blanched, eyes wide. "If they've lost the engines and backups, how do we get home?" I had no answer. We just knew we couldn't trust the official line about minor electrical faults. Around midnight, Clark returned to the atrium, face drawn. He announced that the captain was still assessing the situation on the bridge, but a ripple of panic moved through the crowd when someone pointed out we'd never seen the captain since the lights went out. People demanded answers. Clark tried to placate them, claiming the captain was busy. Then, from behind Clark, the suspicious officer, the one I'd followed, stepped up. He gave us a tight smile, introduced himself as Security Chief Alvarez. "We understand your concerns," he said in a calm, low voice. "My team is working on a solution. Please follow my instructions carefully." He then explained they were dividing passengers into smaller groups, led by assigned crew, for better safety and resource distribution. My alarm bells rang. Why were we being split up? It felt like an attempt to control us. Caroline gripped my hand. I looked around, noticing that Clark's expression was uneasy, as though he disapproved. Alvarez shot him a warning glance, and Clark said nothing. Reluctantly, we allowed ourselves to be guided down separate hallways. Caroline and I stayed together, along with about 20 others. A young crew member told us we'd be escorted to Deck 6 to settle in the dining room, where we could sit at tables and rest. We started walking. It was a long, confusing route, the normal lifts unusable, the stairwells lit only by faint emergency strips. Some older passengers struggled, especially with the heat in certain areas. We had to move slowly, Caroline leaning on her stick. The crew member insisted, "It's just a bit further." But halfway there, we heard shouts echo from behind. Then a door slammed. Our group froze. The crew member's eyes darted back and forth, clearly rattled. We tried asking what was happening, but she claimed ignorance. Then Alvarez appeared at the top of the stairwell, shining a powerful torch. His voice boomed, "Everyone, keep moving." That surge of authority pressed us onward. We reached Deck 6, stepping into a large dining hall that was normally bustling with bright lights and music. Now, it was dim and quiet, tablecloths shadowy lumps in the gloom. There was a single crate of bottled water near the entrance. A few portable lamps flickered. Alvarez told us we'd be safe here, that his security team would lock down the area to prevent looting or panic. Something about the phrase "locked down" made me shiver. He left one armed guard by the door, an imposing man with a radio clipped to his belt. Caroline and I found seats at a table with a mother and her teenage daughter. The mother was in tears, saying she'd lost sight of her husband during the confusion. We tried to console her, but our own anxiety was mounting. The teenage daughter asked if we had any phone signal. Of course we didn't. The mother let out a sob, whispering that she wished they'd never come on this cruise. We sat there for an hour, maybe two, sipping water and listening to the guard's footsteps near the doorway. People were restless, some pacing. A few demanded to leave to find out what was going on. The guard refused, stating that security chief's orders were to keep everyone contained until the power was back. At one point, Clark poked his head in, and I rushed over to him, quietly pleading for the truth. He hesitated, then admitted we'd lost contact with the bridge. The radio signals were patchy, and the backup generator had fully failed. "I don't know why," he murmured. "Alvarez is calling the shots now. Something's not right." He gave me a troubled look, then left, likely not wanting to be caught. Caroline overheard. Her face paled. She asked me what we were supposed to do, but I had no plan. I just knew we couldn't stay trapped in that dining room. Alvarez seemed to be a man with far too much control. Why was he orchestrating all this? If he was simply trying to keep order, fine. But it felt more sinister, especially given that I'd overheard him mention, "No one else knows yet." Around 3 a.m, the guard at the door started nodding off. That's when I made a split-second decision. I told Caroline I was going to slip out, see if I could find the bridge or the lifeboats. She wanted to come, but her knee was playing up badly. She'd slow me down. We agreed she'd stay put, pretend to be asleep, and I'd come back for her if I found anything useful. I crept out of the dining room, heart pounding, navigating by the glow of my phone torch. The corridor was deserted. I remembered from the ship's map that the bridge was forward on Deck 10, but heading straight there seemed risky if Alvarez's security patrols were about. Instead, I aimed to find Clark. He might know a safer route. I guessed he'd be near the engine control rooms on Deck 2, hoping to fix the power. So I took the stairs down, step by step, body tense with every sound. Deck 2 was lit by a handful of red emergency lights, giving everything a hellish glow. The corridors were narrower here, more mechanical. I passed signs for staff-only areas, laundry, storage, engine access. A shadow flickered at the end of a corridor, and I ducked behind a crate, watching. It was Clark, stepping out of a small control room, muttering under his breath. I called his name softly. He jolted, shining a torch in my face, then sighed in relief when he recognized me. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "Alvarez will go mad if he catches you." I told him we needed the truth. He rubbed his temples, then said that the main engine had been tampered with, as had the backup generator. "I suspect sabotage," he whispered, "and Alvarez is in on it. He's controlling the ship section by section. I don't know why." My mind reeled. "Has he harmed anyone physically?" I asked. Clark shrugged. "I've no solid proof, But the captain's missing. I can't reach him. Some of the crew are frightened, but they're following Alvarez's orders because he outranks them in security matters. This was beyond horrifying. A sabotage scenario at sea, and we were stuck, drifting in open waters, no contact with the outside world. I asked if there was a way to fix the generator. Clark shook his head. I'm not an engineer. I need the chief engineer, but I can't find him. Alvarez might have locked him up. I found signs of forced entry near the engine room. He looked around desperately. We have lifeboats, but launching them in the dark without power is dangerous, especially if Alvarez sees us trying. A surge of determination seized me. We have to at least try to signal for help, I said. Clark nodded. Up on deck 14, there's an emergency flare system. If we can reach it, maybe we can alert a passing vessel. The notion of climbing 12 decks in near darkness, avoiding armed patrols, was terrifying. But we had no choice. We set off, quietly climbing a staircase meant for crew. At deck 5, we heard voices. Clark motioned for silence. We peered through a doorway window, seeing a group of passengers with blank stares being led by a security guard. One passenger tried to break away, and the guard shoved him back. My stomach twisted. This was more like hostage-taking than mere crowd control. We hurried on. Around deck 9, we nearly stumbled into Alvarez himself. He stood in a corridor, conferring with 2 guards. We ducked behind a laundry trolley. I caught snippets of their conversation. We'll keep them contained until... Another voice asked. And the crew? Alvarez responded. They'll follow orders or face consequences. My heart thundered. This man was orchestrating a full-blown takeover of the ship. But for what end? Ransom? Terrorism? I had no idea. We managed to slip past while they turned down another corridor. Then we continued to deck 14, breathless with fear. There we found the emergency flare box near a maintenance ladder that led to a small open deck area. My hands shook as I tried to unlock the box. Clark rummaged for a key, cursing under his breath. Finally, we prized it open with a screwdriver from a nearby tool rack. Inside were bright orange flares, the type you shoot into the sky. Clark grabbed one and we scrambled up the ladder. Outside, the wind buffeted us, though the weather wasn't terrible, just a strong sea breeze. The night sky was black, no moon visible. Clark readied the flare. Once this goes up, Alvarez will know, he warned. I nodded. We can't hide forever. We just need to pray there's a nearby ship or plane that sees it. He fired the flare. It shot up, a brilliant red streak across the darkness, then burst into a fiery glow that hung in the sky. My chest tightened with hope, but the night swallowed it quickly, leaving only darkness and the roaring sea. Clark fired a second just to be sure. Then we climbed back down, not sure what else we could do. We had to get back to Caroline, but everything felt impossibly dangerous. We crept along a walkway, intending to return to the dining room. Then footsteps thundered behind us. Alvarez's voice barked, "Halt!" Clark and I broke into a run. He grabbed my wrist, urging me forward. We wove between lifeboat stations, hearts pounding. Alvarez shouted again, closer. There was no cover. Clark pointed to a hatch labeled Crew Lounge. We dove inside, slamming the door behind us. The lounge was empty, dimly lit by a single emergency lamp. We heard Alvarez's footsteps outside. Clark whispered, "We'll hide here until he passes." But a moment later, the door handle rattled. Alvarez must have a master key because the lock clicked. I held my breath, pressing against the wall behind the door. Clark stood next to me, fists clenched. The door swung open, and Alvarez stepped in, shining his torch around. He saw Clark first. "You've meddled enough, Clark," he snarled. "Where's the flare gun?" Clark said nothing. Alvarez advanced, features set in a scowl. I mustered a shred of courage, grabbed a nearby stool, and swung it at Alvarez's torch hand, hoping to dislodge it. The torch flew from his grip, rolling across the floor. Alvarez cursed, stumbling. Clark tackled him, but Alvarez was strong. They wrestled, knocking chairs aside, the lounge echoing with grunts. I tried to help, but Alvarez flung Clark off, then lunged for me. I dodged, half falling over a small table. My heart hammered. Alvarez grabbed my shirt, eyes blazing with anger. "You've ruined everything," he hissed. I lashed out with my foot, catching his shin. He loosened his grip just enough for me to slip free. Clark seized the opportunity, striking Alvarez from behind with the stool. Alvarez collapsed, stunned. We stood there panting, adrenaline surging. Alvarez lay on the floor, dazed, possibly unconscious. Clark found some cable ties in a supply cupboard, and we bound his wrists. My mind reeled. We'd actually overpowered him. But how many other guards were under his command? And what about the passengers? We had to act fast. We hauled Alvarez into a corner, took his radio. Clark radioed to any crew who might be loyal. A crackling response came from someone in engineering. Oh, thank God. He locked the chief engineer in a storeroom. We can break him out now. We urged them to hurry, to restore power if possible. Clark told them Alvarez was neutralized. The engineer's voice trembled with relief. With Alvarez secured, we ventured back to the dining room. We found the armed guard asleep at the door again, clearly not the most dedicated ally. Clark quietly disarmed him, and a few of us subdued him without a struggle. The passengers inside cheered when they realized we'd taken control from Alvarez's men. Caroline, tears in her eyes, hobbled over and hugged me. "I thought I'd lost you," she cried. I nearly broke down in relief. Clark then used Alvarez's radio to instruct all security guards to stand down, claiming Alvarez was incapacitated and that the chief engineer was in charge of immediate operations. Most complied, likely relieved this ordeal was ending. The next hour was chaotic. The crew spread out, freeing people from locked areas, distributing supplies, and searching for the missing captain. Eventually, they found him tied up in a cabin on deck 3. He was battered but alive. At dawn, the engineer managed to jury-rig the backup generator, at least partially. Lights flickered on in some sections. People broke into applause, hugging each other. I stood with Caroline, exhausted, hair matted with sweat. We'd spent a night in near anarchy, but now it seemed we might survive. The bridge took control of steering, though the engines were still down. We had limited thrusters from the auxiliary system to stabilize us. By midday, a cargo vessel spotted our flare residue and our drifting position. They relayed our situation to the Coast Guard. Rescue ships arrived by evening. Helicopters airlifted medical cases first. The rest of us were eventually transferred onto a smaller transport vessel. Standing on that rescue ship's deck, watching the disabled cruise liner fade into the distance, I felt a strange mix of triumph and shock. It all happened so fast. One moment, we were carefree holiday goers. The next, we were fighting off sabotage at sea. We later learned Alvarez had a twisted motive, something to do with extorting the cruise company for a ransom once the ship was rendered helpless. He was apparently part of a ring that infiltrated the security team. The plan fell apart once we got that flare off. Investigations dragged on for months, but I never followed every detail. I just wanted to go home and forget the entire nightmare. It's been half a year since that cruise. Caroline's knee still hurts, and she jokes that she'll never walk another flight of stairs on a ship again in her life. Neither of us is keen on cruises anymore. The thought of those endless corridors in the dark still makes me tense up. Sometimes, I wake at night, recalling the flickering emergency lights and the echo of Alvarez's furious voice. But then I remind myself we fought back, we overcame it, and we saved each other. I'm sharing this because I need to get it off my chest, how an idyllic holiday can turn into a horror show in the blink of an eye. The sense of isolation at sea is real, especially when power fails and phone signals vanish. It's easy to feel trapped, reliant on people who might not have your best interests at heart. If you ever find yourself in a similar spot, trust your instincts. If something feels off, it probably is. And if it comes down to it, never assume the person in uniform is automatically your ally. You might be the only one who can step up, even if you're terrified. I'm a second-year literature student at a well-regarded university in the Midlands. Well-regarded enough that we get a decent amount of media coverage for our annual arts festival. This festival is usually a highlight of the year. Live music, theater performances, creative writing workshops, all that. I'd volunteered to help run a couple of pop-up stalls, and I was buzzing with excitement the week before it started. Little did I know, I was about to become the center of a bizarre public smear campaign. I'm not exactly a social butterfly, but I have a tight-knit group of friends in my course, plus a few acquaintances from the campus writing club. We'd been planning our festival activities for ages. I'd signed up to read one of my short stories at the open mic night, which was nerve-wracking enough on its own. The night before the festival, I was in my tiny student room, scribbling last-minute edits, when I got a text from an unknown number. "Looking forward to your performance tomorrow. Don't disappoint us." I assumed it was a friend being playful. I replied, "Who is this?" No answer. Odd, but I shrugged it off, attributing it to festival hype. The next morning, I arrived at the main quad, helping set up chairs and a makeshift stage for the open mic sessions. A course mate, Tim, spotted me and said, "Hey, weird question. Did you create a second Instagram account?" I frowned, saying no. He showed me his phone, a brand new account with my name and profile picture, but it was definitely not mine. The bio read something like, "Studying literature but aiming for fame soon. Watch me crush the competition." Very un-me. I took Tim's phone, scrolled through the account. It had posted a handful of smug, arrogant comments on the festival's official page, mocking other participants. My stomach sank. "That's not me," I insisted. Tim believed me, but it was jarring. Who would impersonate me like that? Throughout the day, I heard more whispers. Apparently that fake account was posting nasty stories about other lit students, belittling their writing, claiming I was miles ahead of them. People were outraged, messaging me to ask what my problem was. I tried to clear my name, but rumors spread fast in a university environment, especially during a big festival. My phone blew up with notifications, some from strangers calling me an egotistical prat, others from friends verifying if it was real. The festival events kicked off, and I juggled volunteering duties with frantic attempts to message people, telling them I was hacked. Except I wasn't hacked. Someone had made a brand new account. I changed all my passwords anyway, but it didn't matter. The impersonator kept posting. Meanwhile, I tried to hold it together, setting up chairs and banners, distributing flyers for the writing club. Anxiety gnawed at me. Why was someone doing this? Did I offend someone unknowingly? By late afternoon, I decided to report the fake account to Instagram, but that process isn't instant. Meanwhile, the damage was done. People took screenshots, shared them around. A couple of first-year students confronted me, yelling that I was a bully. I tried explaining, nearly in tears. They stormed off, unconvinced. That evening, the open mic segment loomed. I'd been rehearsing a personal story about my childhood struggles, hoping it would resonate with people. But now I felt dread. How many in the audience thought I was some narcissist who'd been posting hateful comments? My friend Annika insisted I go through with the reading, or else the impersonator would win. So I mustered my courage, stepping onto the small stage with sweaty palms. As I began reading, I felt eyes boring into me. Some folks scowled, others seemed curious. My voice shook, but I pushed on, losing myself in the story's emotion. Midway, a sudden commotion erupted at the back of the quad. Someone shouted, "Why are we listening to this fraud?" My concentration shattered. A tall lad with dyed green hair stood up, brandishing his phone. "Look what they posted about me earlier," he yelled. I heard boos, saw people glaring. My cheeks burned. I wanted to bolt. Instead, I stammered, "That's not me. Please just let me finish." The tension was unbearable. I stumbled through the rest of my piece, my voice shaking. When I finished, a smattering of awkward applause sounded, overshadowed by murmurs of discontent. I hurried off stage, tears threatening. Annika guided me away, telling me to breathe. Tim and a couple of others tried to comfort me, but I was mortified. This was supposed to be my creative debut, and it had been derailed by a smear campaign. I wanted to find whoever was behind the fake account and shake them. Over the next day, the impersonator doubled down, posting more vicious jabs at festival performers. They even posted some stolen photos from my private account, pictures of me on holiday with my family, captioned with snide remarks. I changed every password I could think of, scanning my laptop for malware, but found nothing. Meanwhile, more people turned hostile. A few of my acquaintances started avoiding me, apparently not sure what to believe. On the second evening of the festival, I was supposed to host a small panel discussion with local authors. I nearly backed out, fearing confrontation. But the festival coordinator insisted I continue, I was scheduled after all, so I forced myself to attend, praying the authors hadn't seen the impersonator's rubbish. The discussion started well, the authors chatting about their writing processes. Then, halfway through, an audience member raised a hand and asked me a question about my controversial social media presence. My stomach flipped. One of the authors frowned at me, no doubt having heard rumors. I stumbled through an explanation, voice cracking. The panel dissolved into an awkward atmosphere. Afterwards, the authors left quickly, not meeting my eye. I felt humiliated. People whispered. I retreated behind the stage, fighting tears. Tim rushed in, breathless. "Mate, someone posted a new photo on that fake account. A shot of you this morning, setting up stands." My jaw dropped. That meant the impersonator was physically near me, snapping photos. It wasn't just an online troll from afar. They were among us, on campus, possibly even a fellow lit student. The realization sent shivers down my spine. Annika suggested we watch the festival's official forum for patterns. She's good with digital stuff, so she started combing through comments, cross-referencing user activities. We discovered that one user, Blake's, repeatedly defended me, claiming the posts were fake. At first, we thought that meant they were a friend, but then we noticed something off. Blake's posted seconds after the fake account posted, like they had an inside track. Annika suspected the same person controlled both accounts, stirring up drama, then playing savior, a skilled impersonator, leading a double game to intensify the chaos. Our suspicion grew the next morning when Blake's approached me in person, a short, quiet lad from the second-year creative writing module. I'd barely interacted with him before. He offered me a sympathetic ear, said he believed I was innocent. I thanked him, relieved to have an ally. But a nagging doubt persisted, especially when he asked for more details about how I discovered the fake account. He seemed oddly curious about my reaction time, who I'd told, etc. That evening, Tim and I decided to set a trap. Tim posted on our writing club's chat that I'd decided to hold a private reading in an old lecture hall, claiming I wanted to defend myself in front of a small audience. We made it sound official, but we only shared it in a group chat with about 20 people, including Blake's. Then we waited, watching the fake account. Sure enough, within minutes it posted a nasty comment mocking my secret reading. Bingo. Someone in that group chat was behind it, or at least in direct contact with them. We headed to the lecture hall at the appointed time, but instead of me, Tim stood in the shadows with his phone camera ready. Annika watched from outside, covering the exit. If the impersonator showed up, we'd see who it was. Sure enough, about 10 minutes later, footsteps echoed in the corridor. A figure slipped into the darkened hall, phone held up as if filming. Tim pressed record on his phone camera. The figure approached the lectern, presumably expecting me to appear. Then Tim stepped forward, shining a torch. It was Blake's. He froze, face pale. I burst out from behind a row of chairs, phone torch illuminating him. He tried to bluster, claiming he was just there to support me, but we confronted him with the timing of posts, the suspicious behavior. At first he denied it, voice trembling, but eventually he admitted it. "Yes, I made the account," he spat. "You and your fancy clique overshadowed the rest of us. I wanted to prove that the campus would turn on you instantly if they believed you were arrogant." I was stunned. "Why me?" I asked, voice shaking. He launched into a rant about how I'd supposedly hogged attention in our writing club, how people praised my short stories. None of which was entirely true. I'd never tried to overshadow anyone, but he believed it. He said it started as a small prank, then snowballed once he realized how easily people were fooled by the fake arrogance. "I posted more because it felt thrilling," he said, breath ragged. "Watching everyone hate you, then champion you, flipping back and forth." I stared at him, fury and heartbreak mingling in my chest. "You ruined my reputation," I said, my voice unsteady. He shrugged, tears in his eyes as if even he couldn't believe how far he'd gone. Then he bolted for the door. Annika stood in his way. We told him we'd recorded his confession. "No sense running," Tim said flatly. Word spread fast. We made him publicly admitted on the festival's forum. He typed a post detailing how he impersonated me, used alt accounts to fan the flames, and posted those snide comments. People were shocked, some outraged at him, others relieved I was innocent. My head spun, processing the betrayal. Blake's apologized, but it felt hollow. I wanted to scream at him for humiliating me during what should have been a joyful festival. Instead, I just walked away. The next morning, I woke to a flood of supportive messages on social media. People offered apologies for believing the fake account. The festival organizers posted an official statement condemning online impersonation. Blake's was asked to step down from the writing club. The university might take disciplinary action for harassment. I felt numb. A wave of relief, sure, but also a residue of anxiety. My name was cleared, but the damage was done. Some folks still whispered that I must have been partly involved, because internet rumors have a stubborn afterlife. At the festival's closing ceremony, I was invited on stage to share a poem, a gesture from the organizers to show I wasn't at fault. I stood there, heart pounding, reciting a piece about identity and trust. The crowd was kinder this time, clapping supportively. Yet I couldn't shake the memory of that first open mic fiasco. I didn't see Blake's in the audience. He'd vanished from campus after his confession, presumably mortified. In the aftermath, I had to do a lot of personal healing. My mental health took a hit. I found myself constantly checking social media, paranoid about new rumors. I sought counseling at the university's well-being center, something I never expected to need. My friends rallied around me, though, and that solidarity helped. Tim joked we should write a detective story about the fiasco, though it still feels too raw to turn into fiction. I'm sharing all this because you never think it'll happen to you, someone impersonating you, orchestrating a smear campaign out of petty jealousy or misguided revenge. Universities can be hotbeds of drama, especially during big events. Everyone's jockeying for recognition or a chance to shine. I guess Blake's felt overshadowed and lashed out. It's not an excuse, but it's a cautionary tale. Now, a few weeks on, I'm trying to reclaim my online presence, reminding everyone that I'm not that arrogant monster the fake account portrayed. Some folks still send me messages apologizing for the hateful things they said when they thought I was behind the account. Others remain distant, uncomfortable perhaps. Trust is a fragile thing once it's broken, but I still love writing. I'm still planning to read my short stories at future events, and I'll keep volunteering. This festival taught me that malicious people can lurk in unexpected places, even in a cozy writing club. Yet I also saw how quickly some friends stood by me and how the truth eventually surfaced, no matter how twisted the lies were. If you ever end up in a similar situation, gather your real friends, stay calm, and find the proof. Because once you unmask the impersonator, their power collapses, and hopefully you come out stronger, even if it leaves some scars. I wasn't sure I could face that museum again, not after everything that happened 3 years ago. But this month, I found myself walking through its front doors with a shaky resolve. The place was under partial construction, scaffolding up in the west wing, plastic sheeting covering the corridors leading to the old exhibits. I suppose they were renovating, preparing for a new season of visitors, or maybe they were just trying to scrub away the memory of the tragedy that still haunts me. Let me back up a bit. I used to volunteer at this local museum in my hometown, a modest place with a small collection of historical artifacts, some rotating art exhibits, that kind of thing. I was about 19 when I started, just out of college, deciding whether to study archaeology or not. The museum felt like a second home, and I was enthusiastic about learning behind the scenes. Then one night, a man attempted to steal a valuable exhibit, a centuries-old sword supposedly linked to a local legend. I happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, staying late to help an archivist with a backlog of paperwork. I caught the intruder prizing open the display case. We confronted each other, and in the ensuing struggle, the intruder swung the sword at me. A security guard arrived, tried to intervene, and ended up shot by an accomplice. The guard died on the spot. I survived, but the trauma cut deep. The thieves got away with the sword. The guard's name was Dougie. He was a kind, middle-aged father of 2, always shared his tea with volunteers. His death shattered me. I blamed myself for not sounding an alarm sooner, for not running. If I had, maybe Dougie wouldn't have tried to rescue me. Maybe he'd still be alive. The police investigated, but the sword and the culprits vanished. Rumors flew that it was a black market collector or some fanatic obsessed with the sword's legend. Whoever it was, they left me with crippling survivor's guilt. I left the museum, moved away to London for uni, tried to start fresh. But the nightmares persisted. Scenes of Dougie bleeding, me trembling behind a shattered display case. I refused to talk about it. I never even visited Dougie's family. The guilt was too much. Now, 3 years on, the museum announced a partial reopening of a new historical wing, plus some minor construction to upgrade security. My parents, who still live in the area, told me about it. I felt a tug in my chest, a sense that I needed to go back and face my demons. So, here I was, stepping inside the building on a Tuesday afternoon, the place mostly empty. Dust motes hung in the air, the smell of fresh paint mingling with old books. A bored attendant behind a temporary desk asked if I was here for the new exhibit. I said yes, but I mostly wandered aimlessly. I found the spot where Dougie died, now a remodeled corridor with brand new flooring. My throat tightened. I closed my eyes, picturing that night, the horrifying moment. A wave of guilt and sorrow threatened to knock me down. I managed to continue, exploring the newly constructed areas. Scaffolding lined the walls, occasional clangs of tools echoing. The museum planned to open these sections next month, apparently. I turned a corner and stopped short. There, partially visible behind a sheet of plastic, stood a glass display case. Inside lay a sword. It looked identical to the stolen one. My heartbeat thundered. Was it a replica, or had they recovered the original? I approached, peering through the gap. The plaque wasn't fully installed yet, but I could read a portion. Legendary Sword of Merrill Vale, retrieved following a tip-off. My mind spun. So they'd found it. Dougie died protecting that sword, and these thieves had it for 3 years. And now it was back, quietly displayed behind plastic sheeting. A swirl of anger and relief churned in my gut. I had to know more. I sought out an old colleague, Mrs. Jacobs, who used to supervise the volunteer program. She was in the staff room sipping tea and nearly jumped when she saw me. "I didn't expect to see you here, love," she said softly. We chatted, a tremor in my voice as I asked about the sword. She confirmed the police recovered it from a private collector's vault 2 months ago. The museum was reintroducing it once the new security measures were in place. "It's safer now," she said, though her tone was hesitant. "We have a brand new system being installed, plus advanced cameras. The city contributed funds after Dougie's death." I nodded, tears threatening. Before I left, she mentioned there'd been some odd incidents during construction. Tools misplaced, scaffolding tampered with. A handful of workers claimed they saw a cloaked figure skulking around after hours. She shrugged it off as gossip, but I felt a chill. Could someone be planning another theft? I decided to linger until closing, determined to see if anything strange happened. The museum shut to the public around 5, but they allowed me to stay in the staff lounge for a bit, since I was once a volunteer. I pretended to be helping Mrs. Jacobs with some admin. By 5:30, most staff had gone, except for a few construction workers finishing a shift. The hallway lights dimmed to half brightness. I slipped away, weaving among the scaffolding near the new exhibit wing. The building felt eerie in the hush. My footsteps echoed. I peered around, half expecting to see that cloaked figure. Part of me wanted to run, the memory of Dougie's death snapping at my nerves. But I forced myself on. Suddenly I heard a clang from behind a plastic sheet. Heart pounding, I eased it aside, finding a partially constructed corridor lined with crates. A figure crouched there, messing with what looked like a digital security panel on the wall. My gut seized. Was it a worker? The figure wore a hooded coat, not typical construction gear. My mind flashed to the thieves. Without thinking, I grabbed my phone to snap a photo. The flash accidentally went off, illuminating the corridor. The figure whirled around, revealing a glimpse of a determined face. Male, mid-30s, intense eyes. He cursed under his breath, lunging at me. I stumbled back, phone slipping from my hand. He grabbed it, smashing it on the floor. I let out a cry, adrenaline surging. He hissed, "You shouldn't be here," then glanced down the corridor as if expecting someone else. I blurted, "Are you stealing the sword again?" He sneered, "It doesn't belong in a museum." I'm reclaiming it for the cause. My mind reeled. The cause? A fanatic indeed. I tried to back away, but he blocked my path. My pulse hammered so loud I could barely think. He grabbed a length of metal pipe from a nearby crate, brandishing it like a weapon. "Don't move or I'll make this quick," he threatened. I swallowed hard, remembering Dougie's fate. I couldn't let history repeat itself. Summoning courage, I bolted sideways, ducking around a stack of boxes. He swore and swung the pipe, missing me by inches, the clang echoing. I dashed deeper into the corridor, heart thudding, unsure where to go. The place was a maze of half-finished rooms. I found a door to a side stairwell. I yanked it open, stumbling down the steps. Over my shoulder, I saw him giving chase. My lungs burned, but fear propelled me. Halfway down, I heard him thunder behind me, calling out, "You can't outrun me." The stairwell ended at a locked door leading to a storeroom. Panic flared as I realized I was trapped. I rattled the handle, no luck. Footsteps thundered closer. Desperate, I scanned the dim stairwell. A vent above, maybe too small to crawl through. Piles of leftover construction supplies. My eyes landed on a canister of paint thinner. I snatched it up, stepping behind the corner. As soon as he rounded the turn, I hurled the liquid at him, drenching his chest. He yowled, wiping at his face. I seized the moment to slam past him, knocking the pipe from his grip. He spat curses, trying to grab me, but slipped on the spilled fluid. I sprinted back up the stairs, lungs on fire, and emerged into the corridor again. My main thought, get help. But who was left in the building at this hour? The security guard. If I could reach the main entrance, I might find them. I pelted down the hallway, ignoring the throbbing in my chest. The entire building felt like a labyrinth. The lights flickered ominously, construction messing with the electrical circuits, no doubt. I turned a corner near the old staff lounge, nearly colliding with a figure. I recoiled in panic, but it was just Mrs. Jacobs, eyes wide. "What's going on?" she asked. I gasped. "There's a man. He's after the sword. Call the police." She looked alarmed, whipped out her phone, but before she could dial, the man from the stairwell appeared at the end of the corridor, panting, clothes soaked in paint thinner. He locked eyes on us, brandishing the pipe again. Mrs. Jacobs froze. The man smirked. "Hand over the keys to the exhibit or I'll bash both your heads in," he growled. My mind raced. The sword was behind layers of plastic, presumably locked in a new display. Did we even have the right keys? Mrs. Jacobs whispered that the security manager had them. The man snarled, "Then we'll find him." He advanced, and I put my arm out as if to shield Mrs. Jacobs. My heart pounded, but something in me snapped. I refused to let another person die because of this cursed sword. I feigned a step back as if intimidated, but covertly eyed a heavy wooden display stand leaning against the wall. The man demanded, "Where is the manager?" Mrs. Jacobs stammered, "Not here, left earlier," which was probably true. He raised the pipe, frustration twisting his features. "Then we do this the hard way." He lunged at me. I sidestepped, letting him pass, then yanked the display stand from the wall and swung it at his legs. It connected with a dull thud. He staggered, nearly falling. Mrs. Jacobs let out a startled cry. Enraged, he turned on me, pipe whistling through the air. I ducked, the pipe smashing the stand instead, splinters flying. We grappled, tension crackling. He was stronger, forcing me back. My ribs ached from trying to hold him off, but then footsteps echoed from behind him. Security had arrived, presumably alerted by Mrs. Jacobs' call. Two uniformed men tackled the intruder to the ground, wrestling the pipe from his hand. He screamed about the sword's rightful place. One guard pinned him, while the other radioed for police backup. I crumpled to my knees, adrenaline spent, tears mixing with sweat. Mrs. Jacobs steadied me, looking shaken but relieved. The guards kept the intruder subdued until the police turned up. Then it was over. No shots fired, no repeat of Dougie's fate. The man was dragged away, ranting incoherently about how the sword belonged to the old ways, and we had no right to keep it locked up. The aftermath was surreal. Police took statements praising me for my quick thinking. I felt no sense of victory, just exhaustion and the faint stirrings of closure. As they led the intruder out, I stared after him, remembering the thieves who escaped 3 years ago. Was this man connected to them? Possibly. He might have been part of the same group, or a lone fanatic. Either way, Dougie's sacrifice wasn't in vain. The sword remained safe. and no one died this time. Over the next few days, I visited the museum to finalize paperwork for the police. The place was abuzz with talk of the attempted theft. Staff expressed relief that the new security system, though unfinished, had helped contain the situation. I asked if I could see Dougie's memorial. There was a small plaque in the staff corridor. Standing before it, I finally felt able to pay respects. I whispered, "I'm so sorry." And for the first time, I didn't break down. Instead, I felt a quiet resolve. I'd faced the place that haunted me, and I wasn't running anymore. On my last day in town, I spoke to Dougie's widow on the phone, apologizing for not reaching out sooner. She was gracious, said she never blamed me. That conversation lifted a weight from my heart. Though the sadness lingered, at least now I'm not paralyzed by guilt. I might even volunteer at the museum again once the renovations are done, not full-time, but enough to honor Dougie's memory by ensuring it remains a safe place for history to be shared. As I left the museum one final time before heading back to London, I passed that newly installed display for the sword, surrounded by scaffolding. The curator told me they'd strengthen the glass, add high-tech locks. "We'll be prepared next time," he assured me. I nodded, unsure if I'd ever believe any place is truly safe. But I guess trying to protect what matters is all we can do. I'm sharing this because survivor guilt can twist your life into knots. Sometimes the only way forward is to confront the site of your trauma head-on, and sometimes it tests you all over again, like the museum's prepared trap for a fanatic, an intruder who fell for his own obsession. I still have nightmares of that night 3 years ago, but now they end differently. I see Dougie's face, and I remind myself that we all did our best. And now, perhaps, I can keep living with a little less regret, knowing that when I had the chance to stand my ground and protect another, I did. Dougie would have wanted that. I'm sure the museum will always carry a trace of sorrow for me, but it also holds a seed of healing, a testament to resilience. Walking those halls, hearing the echo of my footsteps over fresh floors, I sense that Dougie's presence lingers in every new security measure, every renovated display. He won't be forgotten, and maybe that's enough for me to forgive myself at last. I never thought my biggest scare at university would come during a staff strike, of all times. You'd think the worst that might happen would be a few canceled lectures and noisy protests. But what started as a mild inconvenience for me at Canterbury University turned into something that still makes me double-check my back at every corner. I was in my second year studying media and communications. Naturally, I was used to campus disruptions, demonstrations, boycotts, all that. My old comprehensive school never prepared me for the sheer intensity of campus politics, but I adapted quickly. I'd been juggling a part-time job at a local cafe, barely making rent for my shared flat with 2 housemates. My routine was pretty standard: pop by the library in the morning, attend the odd seminar, then dash to the cafe for an afternoon shift. One particular week, though, the staff strike escalated, classes got suspended, the library drastically reduced its hours, and tension pulsed around campus like a ticking time bomb. On day 2 of the strike, I decided to use the extra time to work on a documentary project. I specialized in digital storytelling, so I was eager to film the protests. My plan was to capture interviews from striking lecturers at the picket lines outside the main gates. I'd never been particularly political, but I found it all fascinating from a media angle. That morning, I set out with my camera kit, wearing a thick hoodie because February winds whipped mercilessly across the campus. Only a handful of students braved the cold to stand in solidarity with the lecturers. I filmed them chanting, brandishing homemade signs. That's where I met Lottie. She was leaning against a lamppost, eyes scanning the crowd, phone in hand. She wore a bright pink beanie and had a camera bag slung over her shoulder. She looked approachable, so I wandered over, asked if she was also filming. She said she was a journalism student doing a piece for the university's online paper. We bonded over the difficulty of capturing good audio in the wind. She seemed nice, bubbly, quick with a laugh. We exchanged phone numbers, planning to collaborate on covering the strike from different angles. Over the next few days, Lottie and I met up in random campus nooks to share footage, compare notes. The more I got to know her, the more I appreciated her thoroughness. She'd already interviewed half a dozen protesters, plus the head of the union chapter. She urged me to aim bigger, maybe speak with the administration. So I tried emailing the chancellor's office for a statement, but got no reply. Then Lottie mentioned she had a contact in the IT department who might leak a memo about how the university was planning to retaliate against striking staff. It sounded sensational, but the campus press was all over such rumors. I was conflicted about diving into the messy side of it all, but Lottie's enthusiasm rubbed off on me. One evening, after my cafe shift, I found a missed call from Lottie. Her text read something like, "Got something major. Meet me outside the old humanities building at 9 p.m. My curiosity spiked, though I felt uneasy about the clandestine vibe. Still, I trusted her well enough. I grabbed my camera and trotted across the dimly lit campus. The staff shortage from the strike meant fewer security patrols, and the place felt half empty. Lamps cast flickers of light along the footpaths. I passed the library, shuttered early due to the strike, and reached Old Humanities. Its imposing stone facade loomed out of the dark. Lottie wasn't there. I rang her, no answer. Feeling chilly, I tucked my hands in my hoodie pockets. Then I noticed a glow from inside the building's glass doors, which were usually locked at that hour. I pushed them gently, surprised they opened with a creak. Rows of dark corridors stretched before me, and the hum of the emergency lighting gave me goosebumps. "Lottie," I called, stepping inside. Faint footsteps echoed from somewhere to my right. I followed the sound, scanning each branching corridor. The place smelled of old textbooks and dust, reminiscent of after-hours library stints. I turned a corner and nearly jumped out of my skin. A figure in a hooded jacket stood near a flickering overhead light. At first I thought it might be Lottie, but the build was different. Taller, broader. The person was fiddling with something on the wall, a small metal box with blinking lights that I recognized as a campus router or network hub. Our university had them stashed away in certain corridors to boost Wi-Fi. This figure looked up sharply at me. I couldn't see the face under the hood, just a hint of a frown. Do you know Lottie?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The figure didn't reply. Instead, they jammed some cables back into the box, shut the panel door, and strode off towards a stairwell. Bewildered, I followed a few steps, calling, "Oi, who are you?" But they vanished into the stairwell, footsteps echoing. I was left alone in the corridor, heart pounding. Just then, my phone buzzed. I glanced down to see a notification for an email from Admin Department. The subject line read, "Urgent Strike Contingency Plans." My eyebrows shot up. It had come to my personal student email, not the official campus one, and the timing was bizarre. I tapped it open, scanning quickly. It appeared to be a leaked memo detailing how the university intended to dock pay and potentially freeze staff benefits during prolonged strikes. If genuine, it was huge. Exactly the kind of scoop Lottie had hinted at. But why send it to me directly? And who had the ability to manipulate the campus network to push such an email? I tried calling Lottie again, still no answer. My mind whirled. Maybe she or her IT contact had forced the email through. But that hooded figure messing with the router, could that have been the contact? Or someone else entirely? I decided to walk upstairs, see if Lottie was waiting on the second floor. I found a hallway of locked classrooms, their windows dark. At the far end, a faint glow slipped under a door labeled Computer Lab 2. I tried the handle, unlocked. Inside, only half the overhead lights worked. Rows of outdated desktops filled the space. One at the far corner was switched on, screen shining. I approached, noticing a flash drive plugged in. On the screen was a file directory containing multiple PDFs with names like strike_actions, budget_cuts, staff_emails_confidential. I froze. This looked like sensitive data. My heart raced. This was way above my pay grade as a simple media student. My moral compass whirled. Should I gather the info? Should I walk away? As I hovered, my phone buzzed again with another email, this time from an unknown address. "Leave it. We're watching." A chill shot through me. I whirled around, half expecting someone to stand behind me in the lab. It was empty. Gulping, I yanked the flash drive out of the computer. A small voice in my head said I was crossing a line, but curiosity and a sense of journalistic duty pushed me on. If the administration was plotting something unethical, people needed to know. But the menacing tone of that email made me quake with anxiety. We're watching. Who was we? I stuffed the flash drive into my hoodie pocket, powered off the machine, and bolted out of the lab. My footsteps echoed in the empty corridor. Before I reached the stairs, I saw the hooded figure again, lurking near a water fountain. This time, I forced a confrontation. "Hey, what's going on?" I snapped. They turned to face me. The corridor's fluorescent light revealed a young face, surprisingly plain, but the eyes were piercing. They took one step closer, then hissed, "You had no right. This is bigger than you." "What is?" I demanded, adrenaline surging. Instead of answering, they snatched at my pocket where the flash drive was. I jerked away, nearly losing my balance. We grappled for a second, but I was lighter and managed to twist free. Without a second glance, I dashed down the stairs, heart hammering so loudly I thought I'd faint. The figure didn't follow, or if they did, they vanished somewhere along the way. I fled the building, practically sprinting across the quad. By then, it was near 9:30, my breath fogging in the cold. I half expected to see Lottie waiting outside, but she wasn't there. My phone beeped with a new text, an unknown number again. "Stop, or you'll regret it." A wave of dread pooled in my stomach. Back in my flat, hands shaking, I tried to ring Lottie once more. This time she picked up, sounding groggy. She claimed she'd never made it to Old Humanities because she'd been ill and had gone home early. She had no idea who sent the text summoning me there. I stammered out the details of my terrifying run-in, but she seemed just as confused as I was. I ended the call, feeling more isolated than ever. The next morning, I found the entire leaked memo from my email had vanished. I checked my trash folder, archives, gone. The same with my phone's photos. I'd snapped a quick pic of the computer lab screen. Everything was wiped clean. Then I noticed my social media accounts had weird login attempts. Someone was systematically erasing traces of that night. Panicking, I grabbed the flash drive from my hoodie pocket. At least I still had that. Or so I thought. When I plugged it into my laptop, it was empty. No PDF, no data, just a blank drive. I tried confronting the administration, but they feigned ignorance about any leaked documents. The IT department insisted no unauthorized access had been detected. Meanwhile, Lottie's phone started acting up. Random reboots, missing files. We joked, uneasily, that a secret campus espionage ring had us in their sights, but it didn't feel so funny. The sense of being watched loomed for weeks. The strike ended soon after, with a mediocre settlement. Life on campus returned to normal, but I never forgot the person in the hood or their threat. Whenever I saw Lottie, we'd exchange uneasy looks. We both suspect that someone manipulated the campus Wi-Fi to feed me the leak, then tried to scare me into dropping it. They succeeded. I never broadcast what I saw that night. Even now, the idea that a normal-looking student, or staffer, or outside infiltrator had such power over campus systems chills me. They nearly got the flash drive off me. They erased everything else. If I'd been slower, would they have done something worse? I'm sharing this in my final year, safely on the brink of leaving the university bubble. Maybe it's a cautionary tale. Be careful how deep you dig, especially when powerful entities might be threatened. Sometimes the biggest horror on campus isn't a violent crime, but the subtle manipulation of information, carried out by seemingly normal people who can vanish without a trace. I'm still finishing my documentary, but I focus on the human side of the strike. No mention of that data or the corridor confrontation. Some might call it cowardly, but I call it self-preservation. I don't fancy receiving more messages telling me to stop. Once I graduate, I hope to put this behind me. Yet a part of me remains convinced that person in the hood is still out there, watching, ensuring their secrets remain buried. I haven't stepped into a museum after dark since that night, and I doubt I ever will again. This happened a couple of years back when I was working as a part-time security guard at the Blackwood Museum in Leeds. Not the biggest museum, but a respected one, known for its rotating exhibits on local history and oddities. It was never my dream job. I'd always loved painting and wanted to be an art teacher, but money was tight, so I took what I could get. That evening, I was pulling a solo shift on a Sunday, which was unusual because we usually had 2 guards. My partner called in sick, and management couldn't find a replacement. "Just lock up on time, do the usual checks, and we'll see you in the morning," they told me. I wasn't thrilled, but I figured how hard could it be? The museum closed at 5, so I just had to make sure everyone left, then do a final walkthrough and lock up by 5:30. At 5 o'clock, the overhead announcements played, instructing visitors to make their way to the exits. I was posted by the main door, watching the small trickle of people leaving. A woman with a pram, an older couple, a cluster of teenagers giggling at their phones. By 10 past, I saw no new visitors coming out. The exhibit halls seemed empty. Perfect. I started my checks, stepping through each gallery. Prehistoric hall, empty. Local folklore section, quiet. Then I reached the newly added cryptic relics exhibit, featuring a hodgepodge of archaeological oddities from around the region. One piece that always caught my eye was a battered old chest, said to have been dug up near the site of a medieval battle. The label read, "Origin Unknown," which spooked me. Local legend claimed it once held cursed items. Silly lore, I assumed. Anyway, as I stood there, I had the odd feeling someone was watching me. I scanned the exhibit. A few cabinets, some pedestals with relics under glass. No sign of anyone. The hush felt unnerving. I told myself to hurry up and lock up. My shift was nearly done after all. On my way to the staff office, I noticed a side door ajar, a door that should have been locked. My gut clenched. The sign above it read, "Storage and Archives." Maybe housekeeping forgot to shut it. I poked my head in, shining my torch. Rows of shelves stacked with crates and labeled boxes. All quiet, except near the far corner, I glimpsed movement. A crouched figure rifling through a box. My heart leapt. I called out, "Excuse me, you can't be in here." They froze. Then, faster than I'd have thought possible, they darted behind a set of shelves. I sprinted after them, nearly tripping over a crate. When I turned the corner, they were gone, the far door squeaking shut behind them. That door led deeper into the museum to staff-only corridors. Great. I radioed the front desk, but no one answered. Everyone had gone home. I cursed under my breath and decided to handle it myself. I followed the corridor, checking each locked storage room. All secure, no sign of forced entry. Where could they have gone? Eventually, I came across a crumpled piece of paper on the ground. It was a partial blueprint of the museum layout, with certain sections circled, including the cryptic relics exhibit. My stomach flipped. Why target that? The blueprint looked old, edges yellowed. A chill teased my spine. Maybe this person had planned a theft or wanted to sabotage an exhibit. I had to find them, or at least confirm they'd left. Heading back to the main galleries, I switched off lights as I went, hoping to flush them out. Darkness spread behind me. The hush felt oppressive. In the distance, an odd scraping sound echoed. I followed it into the cryptic relics hall. The overhead lights remained on for security reasons, but the corners were shadowy. My torch beam played across the relic displays. Nothing seemed disturbed until I reached the battered chest. The glass cover had been slid aside, the chest's lid slightly ajar. My pulse kicked. Had they tampered with it? I approached gingerly. Something inside the chest glinted. I peered closer, just the reflective interior. My nerves were probably conjuring illusions. That's when the overhead lights flickered. For a fraction of a second, I thought I saw a figure standing behind me in the reflection. I spun around. No one. The lights steadied. My heart thundered. I'd had enough. I decided to sound the alarm and ring the police. This was beyond a typical end-of-day check. I strode to the security office, found the emergency phone. Before I could dial, I spotted the CCTV monitors. One camera feed showed the main hall, another the gift shop, another the staff entrance. Then I saw something that made my blood run cold. The storeroom camera displayed a shadowy shape crossing the floor, heading for the door I'd left from. So the intruder was back in the archives. If I called the police, I might lose them before they arrived. A reckless surge of adrenaline told me to catch them myself. I grabbed my torch and hurried back. The storeroom was quiet, the door wide open. I scanned the shelves. No one. Then I noticed another door at the back, typically locked. leading to the old caretaker's corridor. It hung open by an inch. This corridor was narrow, dusty, seldom used. I crept along, senses on high alert. A single bulb overhead cast a weak glow. Halfway in, the overhead light died with a pop. Darkness swallowed me. I fumbled with my torch, cursing. The beam revealed peeling wallpaper and a trail of footprints in dust. Great. Footprints that presumably weren't mine. Following the footprints, I reached a dead end, a locked door that opened onto an exterior staff courtyard. The footprints stopped there. The door was locked from the inside. Was the intruder trapped? I tried the handle. Stuck. Then a soft voice came from the darkness behind me. "What are you looking for?" I whipped around, torch shaking. A man, unremarkable, maybe mid-40s, plain clothes, stood there. He held a small object in his hand. My mind screamed danger, but I forced out words. "This area's off limits. You need to leave." He cocked his head. "You don't understand. I'm here to fix a mistake." My heart hammered. "What mistake?" He smirked, stepping forward. "That chest. It never should have been displayed. Now people will come looking for it." I tried to radio again for backup, but I'd stupidly left the radio on the office desk. My phone had no signal in the old corridor. The man must have sensed my panic. He raised both hands in a calming gesture. "I'm not here to hurt you, but someone else might be. I have to destroy the evidence before they arrive." That made no sense. "Destroy what evidence?" I demanded. He nodded at my torch, as though instructing me to lead. Confused, I backed away, heading towards the door from which I'd come. He followed a few paces behind, arms lowered but tense. My instincts yelled that he might be armed, yet he hadn't threatened me, just insisted he needed to destroy something. Perhaps he was the intruder who tampered with the chest. We re-entered the storeroom. He gestured for me to close the door. I refused. Instead, I demanded clarity. He pressed his lips together. "If you won't help, I'll do it alone." He brushed past me, heading towards the main gallery. My adrenaline spiked. I couldn't let him roam freely. I followed, trying not to lose sight of him. He moved swiftly, almost as if he'd memorized the museum layout. Within minutes, we were back at the cryptic relics exhibit. He made a beeline for the battered chest, rummaging inside it with sure hands. I barked at him to stop, but he kept going, retrieving a small cloth bundle from the chest's corner. "This," he hissed, glancing around as though expecting someone. "If they get their hands on it, more people will die." I stared, my mind spinning. "You're insane," I managed. "That's a museum artifact." He half laughed, half grimaced. "It's cursed, or call it what you will. It belongs hidden, not displayed." The overhead lights flickered again. A wave of dread washed over me, remembering the footsteps, the blueprint, the sense we weren't alone. Suddenly, glass shattered at the far end of the exhibit. We both spun around to see another figure, a woman in dark clothes, hurled a metal bar at a display case. She turned her face towards us, eyes glittering. "Hand it over," she snarled, striding forward. My uninvited companion clutched the cloth bundle to his chest. "Stay back," he warned. She advanced, raising the bar. I was torn between tackling her or calling the police. Fear paralyzed me. Before she could swing, he lunged, smashing the relic bundle onto the floor. A flash of something metallic or glass glinted. She shrieked, "No!" and rushed forward, knocking him aside. He toppled into a display, sending relics clattering. I shouted for both of them to stop, but chaos reigned. She lifted the bar to strike him. Instinct took over. I grabbed a heavy torch bracket from the wall and held it up, heart in my throat. "Get away from him!" I bellowed. She glared at me, then let out a frustrated cry. "You've ruined everything. Now no one can have it." With that, she sprinted out of the gallery, footsteps echoing down the hall. I turned to the man, who groaned in pain on the floor. The cloth bundle lay torn open, revealing shards of some ancient object. He coughed, pushing himself up. "Thank you," he rasped. "Better it's destroyed than in evil hands." Police sirens cut through the air, faint at first but growing louder. Relief flooded me. Someone must have heard the commotion or the alarm was finally triggered. I knelt by the man, demanded answers. He just shook his head, eyes distant. I was part of the team that discovered it years ago. We sealed it away for a reason. The museum staff revived it for publicity. His gaze flicked to the chest, regret etched on his face. The police arrived soon after. I gave a frantic statement, though I sounded half-mad describing relic curses and intruders. The man was taken to hospital with minor injuries. The woman had vanished. CCTV footage was mysteriously corrupted, some cameras blank, others flickering. The only clear images were of me running around, apparently chasing shadows. The cloth shards were swept up, but some bits were missing by the time the authorities arrived. The museum's official line was that it was an attempted burglary. They never acknowledged the missing relic pieces publicly. I quit the job soon after. Couldn't stomach the late shifts anymore. Sometimes, I wonder if that item truly was cursed, or if it was just valuable enough for criminals to want it. Either way, someone manipulated the cameras, destroyed evidence, and vanished with partial fragments. The man who tried to save it never contacted me again. I heard rumors that he disappeared from the hospital, possibly to continue his crusade of burying secrets. Months later, I read in the local news that the battered chest was quietly removed from the exhibit. No official explanation. Maybe the museum realized it was more trouble than it was worth. I still feel eyes on me whenever I pass an exhibition hall, as if I'm being judged for letting those shards slip away. The unknown person with a motive remains at large, presumably. I just hope no one tries to put that relic back together. I can't prove it's dangerous, but I'd rather not find out. My only solace is that I tried to do my job, though sometimes I wake at night, hearing that woman's scream echo in my dreams, haunted by the fragment of an ancient horror I never should have witnessed. I've worked at Rowland & Hart for nearly 4 years. It's a mid-sized finance consultancy in Birmingham, known for handling complicated mergers and acquisitions. Not exactly the setting you'd expect for a horror story. But let me tell you, what happened during our mid-crisis reorganization would make any haunted house look tame. It's not the jump scare type of terror, more the slow dread of realizing you can't trust your environment or your colleagues. It all started when the company's biggest client threatened to pull out because of a scandal involving misused funds. Suddenly, the entire office was in meltdown mode. People working overtime, rummaging through old files, trying to patch holes in the records. Management used the phrase mid-crisis. So often it became a running joke in the break room. Meanwhile, the CEO, Mr. Colburn, vanished into hush-hush meetings, leaving the rest of us guessing. I'd always been conscientious, maybe too earnest for my own good. My role was a mid-level data analyst, checking spreadsheets for anomalies. I'd never had a single disciplinary note, so I was startled when HR summoned me one afternoon. The HR manager, a polished woman named Gloria, told me the CEO had requested my assistance with an internal compliance review. I assumed it meant extra hours. She insisted it would be a big responsibility, but the company needed me. Flattered, I agreed. That's how I found myself the next day in a small conference room on the 14th floor, rummaging through boxes of old financial statements. Another colleague was there, Lawrence, a quiet chap from legal. We both wondered why we'd been chosen. The instructions were vague. Search for any irregularities, highlight them, pass them up the chain. The crisis had everyone on edge, so we didn't ask too many questions. Lawrence and I worked late for days, scanning thousands of pages, digitizing them into a secure server. Oddly, the server's login was controlled by an IT specialist I'd never met named Heather. Each evening I'd ring her for an access code and she'd give me a new one. Something about that felt off. Why not just assign me a permanent login? But I was too swamped to push back. One night, 10:30, the office was nearly empty. Lawrence had left an hour earlier. I was alone in the conference room, flipping through the final stack of paperwork. I noticed a discrepancy in a set of documents from 5 years prior. Big sums funneled into a project labeled Profile Growth. The numbers didn't match what was reported in the annual statements. My alarm bells rang. This looked like intentional misreporting. I told myself I'd ask Heather about it. So I tried dialing her extension, but it went straight to voicemail. With a sigh, I decided to leave it for the morning. Before leaving, I headed to the bathroom. The corridor lights dimmed at that hour, and the hush made the hair on my arms stand up. I passed the CEO's office, glass walls revealing darkness inside. Then I heard a rustling noise. I froze. A faint glow seeped under the door. Strange. He was meant to be out of town. Curiosity got the better of me. I crept closer, heart thrumming. Peeking in, I saw a figure crouched by Mr. Colburn's desk, rummaging through drawers by the light of a small torch. My first thought was, a thief. But who breaks into a CEO's office after hours? Without thinking, I knocked on the glass. The figure sprang up, a silhouette in the gloom. I recognized the sleek bob of hair, Gloria from HR. She stared at me for a moment, eyes wide, then marched to the door and pulled it open with forced composure. "What are you doing?" I blurted. She flicked off her torch. "Collecting some documents for the review," she said briskly. My gut told me she was lying. "At this hour?" I pressed. Gloria's lips curved in a tight smile. "We're all under pressure. Why are you here so late?" I stammered something about verifying data. She stepped out, closing the door behind her, effectively blocking my view of whatever she'd been searching. "I'll lock up. You should go home," she said, dismissive. Then she turned on her heel and walked away. I felt oddly threatened, like I'd intruded on something. The next morning I arrived bright and early, hoping to ask about the profile growth discrepancy. Lawrence was already there, looking shaken. He whispered that Gloria had scolded him for digging in the wrong boxes. She said I was overstepping. He told me, baffled. My stomach twisted. This compliance review was starting to feel like a smokescreen. Later that day, Heather from IT came to see me, unnervingly cheerful. She suggested I pass all new anomalies directly to her before logging them. "Better safe than sorry," she cooed, handing me a brand new memory stick. "It's more secure." Something about her grin gave me chills. That afternoon I tried scanning the profile growth documents. Strangely, the scanning software crashed repeatedly. A pop-up said, "File corrupted." No matter what I did, the data wouldn't upload. Then my phone rang, a blocked number. A voice muffled said, "Stop trying to push that file, it's off limits." My breath caught. "Who is this?" I demanded. The line went dead. I confronted Lawrence, but he just shrugged helplessly. "We're in over our heads," he muttered. "I might ask for a transfer." I felt the same dread swirling. Something was definitely rotten here. Over the next few days, my attempts to highlight anomalies were stonewalled by technical issues. Meanwhile, Heather kept calling me up, her voice artificially sweet, encouraging me to focus on more recent data, dear. The CEO was nowhere to be seen. Gloria roamed the office with an air of watchfulness, popping up behind me at odd times. One evening, I stayed behind again, couldn't let go of the puzzle. I tried scanning the profile growth papers using a separate machine in a different department. The file uploaded successfully. Victory. I emailed it to my personal account for safety. Then I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around, heart lurching. It was Mr. Colburn, the CEO, looking exhausted. He asked calmly what I was doing. I stammered an explanation about verifying older records. He smiled thinly. "That's not your remit," he said. "Focus on the assigned tasks. Everything else is a distraction." His tone brooked no argument. I nodded, feeling small. He walked away, footsteps echoing on the polished floor. By the time I got home, that email had vanished from my inbox, replaced by an auto message. "File removed for security reasons." My jaw dropped. They'd manipulated my personal email now. This was insane. Then I discovered the new memory stick Heather gave me was forcibly encrypting everything I copied. Panic took hold. I was clearly meddling with something big, and the entire management chain was complicit. The real horror, though, was how calm they all were, how easily they hid behind procedure. I tried confiding in a close colleague, Priya, from another department. She seemed sympathetic, but the next day she avoided me, claiming she was told not to engage in gossip. Word spread that I was stepping on toes. I felt isolated. Meanwhile, the crisis deepened. Rumors flew about mass layoffs, about the CFO resigning in disgrace. Official memos insisted everything was under control. Then came the final straw. One night, I discovered my desk drawers rummaged through, personal notes tossed about. A single slip of paper remained with the words "Stay quiet or else" scrawled in red marker. My blood ran cold. Next morning, I confronted Gloria about it. She feigned shock, telling me perhaps I needed time off to rest. Heather appeared at my side, nodding agreement. Their eyes bored into me, half concern, half threat. It felt like the entire floor was in on it, complicit in burying the truth. That same afternoon, an all-staff meeting was called. The CEO made a polished speech about reorganization, about consolidating roles, how we had to trust the leadership team. I scanned the crowd, noticing how many faces looked blank, as if they'd surrendered to the facade. Near the back, Lawrence caught my eye, mouthing, "I'm leaving." I gave him the smallest nod. It might be best for both of us. After the meeting, I found an envelope on my chair. Inside was a severance offer. No explanation. Just a large sum if I resigned immediately and signed an NDA. My heart pounded with a mix of relief and rage. So this was how they did it. Bribe me into silence. I pictured all those anomalies, the profile growth fiasco, the manipulations. They wanted me gone before I blew the whistle. I could fight it, but would it matter? They'd bury me in legal trouble. With a sinking feeling, I realized that person in a position of trust might be the entire management chain. The real monstrous presence was the leadership circle, acting in perfect synergy to silence any threat to their secrets. That evening, I called my parents, tearfully confessing the situation. They urged me to protect myself. I hadn't the finances to take on a major corporation in court. Next day, I signed the papers, turned in my pass, left with a cardboard box of my belongings. Heather offered a final sugary goodbye, eyes glittering with triumph. Gloria shook my hand stiffly, not meeting my gaze. Mr. Colburn was nowhere to be seen, presumably orchestrating the next move. Walking away from that tower felt surreal. Part of me wanted to throw everything online, expose them. But the NDA weighed heavily. I knew they'd come after me legally, and who would believe it without evidence? They'd systematically destroyed or encrypted every file I'd found. My attempts to gather proof had been thwarted at every turn. The real horror was how quietly they'd done it, never resorting to overt violence, just constant intimidation, hidden or disguised threats. A creeping dread that seeped into every corner of my daily life until I gave up. Now I'm in a new job, smaller firm, away from corporate sharks. I sleep better, though nightmares of the 14th-floor conference room still visit me. In them, I see boxes of papers that shift and swirl, morphing into faces of colleagues who demand I keep quiet. I jolt awake, heart hammering. Occasionally I Google Roland and Hart scandal, half hoping someone else had the courage to blow it open. So far, nothing. The hush remains. Another wave of acquisitions. Another crisis, no doubt. No. I'm sharing this because people talk about workplace horror as though it's just nasty bosses or stressful tasks. But sometimes, it's darker. An entire system can be complicit in wrongdoing, stepping on anyone who probes too deeply. The scariest part is that you can't necessarily pin down a single antagonist. Everyone in power is part of the machine. They greet you with corporate smiles, reassure you you're valued, then quietly sabotage or threaten you the moment you edge near the truth. I used to see offices as safe, predictable spaces. Now I know better. Monsters don't always hide under the bed. Sometimes they wear tailored suits and grin in boardrooms. I wish I'd had the strength to blow the whistle. But survival instincts prevailed. Maybe one day, someone with the resources and backbone to stand up to them will come along. Until then, Roland and Hart's hidden or disguised threats remain sealed behind closed doors, overshadowed by a polished PR narrative. And I'm left with the memory of a neat severance, a heavy NDA, and a lingering sense that I brushed against a real horror, an insidious corporate labyrinth that devours truth seekers. I try to move on, but every time I see a news snippet about corporate malfeasance, my mind flashes back to those boxes and hush-hush phone calls. The real terror is knowing how easily a system can close ranks and keep you quiet, forever wondering what monstrous secrets lurk in the files you almost uncovered. I suppose there's a certain calm that comes from believing the past is firmly behind you, but I learned the hard way that sometimes buried truths find their way back to the surface. I was working as a freelance researcher for a local historical society when I got the call that changed everything. The museum in my hometown, one I used to visit as a child, wanted me to investigate a newly discovered set of documents tied to an old cold case. They were hoping my background in archival research would shed light on a decades-old theft. I jumped at the chance, partly out of curiosity, partly out of nostalgia. After all, I'd spent so many afternoons wandering that museum's corridors when I was little. The idea of peeling back the layers of local history thrilled me. I never once suspected the horrors that would unfold at closing time when the corridors fell silent and someone, lurking in the shadows, sought to erase the truth. I arrived at the museum on a blustery Tuesday afternoon. The gray skies made the old brick building feel even more imposing. My contact was Mr. Darnell, the head curator, a man with an impeccable reputation in the field. He showed me a small office near the back where I could lay out my documents. It felt odd being here in an official capacity rather than as a casual visitor. The museum was a labyrinth of exhibition halls, storage rooms, and a workshop for restoration projects. Within an hour, I was hunched over a pile of yellowed records, frayed newspapers, and notes that seemed to reference a theft in the 1970s. Some ancient artifact had gone missing, with no culprit ever identified. The museum had hushed it up at the time, not wanting to stain its reputation, but rumors persisted that someone high up was involved. I remember looking at a series of typed security logs from 1973. Names were redacted, but a single initial appeared repeatedly: R. That letter accompanied odd comments about unlocking cases, late-night movements in the gallery, strange transactions. I flagged it in my notebook, curious if R stood for someone who once worked here. Mr. Darnell lingered behind me, brow furrowed. He said quietly, "If you find anything that could damage the museum, let me know before you make any official record. We have to be careful." His tone was measured, but it sent a chill through me. It hinted there was more at stake than a dusty old story. He was a respected professional in the field, known for championing historical preservation. But he seemed worried about the museum's image, perhaps worried enough to want me to keep certain details quiet. Over the next few days, I noticed how uneasy some staff seemed whenever I mentioned the old theft. One archivist, a lovely woman named Karen, initially told me she'd help me gather anything I needed. Then, after a closed-door meeting with Mr. Darnell, she became evasive, insisting she had no extra documents to share. Evidence vanished from the storeroom too. Records and ledgers I'd glimpsed the day before were suddenly missing. When I confronted Karen, she just shrugged. They must have been misplaced. At first, I assumed it was just disorganization. Museums often have cluttered archives. But then it happened again and again, always the items linked to that mysterious R. It felt more like sabotage. One evening, I stayed past the usual visitor hours, determined to get to the bottom of this. I had special permission from Mr. Darnell to remain in the archives so long as I locked up behind me. The museum felt different at closing time, with the public gone and the lights dimmed. Echoes lingered in the halls, and I felt a prickling awareness that I was alone among relics of centuries past. I was rummaging through a battered cardboard box labeled MISC 1973-1975 when I heard footsteps somewhere beyond the archive door. My heart thumped. No one else was meant to be here. I told myself it was probably the security guard. Still, I called out, "Hello?" The footsteps paused, then receded. A few minutes later, I discovered a small diary tucked beneath old receipts. It bore no name, only the date, 1973, on the inside cover. Flicking through its pages, my pulse spiked. An employee's daily notes about suspicious after-hours tours, references to an artifact of great value, bribes, blackmail. Then, near the end, the writer identified the ringleader by name, referencing a quiet transaction that took place one night after the museum shut. My eyes widened when I saw the name, a prominent figure in the museum's past, now revered for his contributions. The final pages described fear and intimidation. Whoever wrote it must have felt threatened. I realized this diary was the key, living proof that the theft had been an inside job. The initials matched R. The writer's name was Rachel or Ruth. The handwriting wasn't clear. My first instinct was to make a digital copy at once, but the museum scanner in the office was out of service. I decided to photograph the pages with my phone for safety. That's when the lights above me flickered. The entire archive seemed to hum with tension. A second later, the overhead lights went out, plunging me into near darkness. My phone torch revealed dusty shelves and boxes, my shadows dancing on the walls. My heart hammered. The building's power occasionally tripped, especially after storms, but that didn't stop me from feeling vulnerable. Shoving the diary into my bag, I crept to the corridor. The emergency lights in the hallway cast a weak glow. Again, I heard footsteps. This time, they were closer. I hurried around a corner, intending to find the security guard or at least some staff member. The main gallery stretched before me in half-light, sculptures looming like silent sentinels. Halfway through, I nearly collided with Mr. Darnell. He jumped, hand pressed to his chest. "You frightened me," he said breathlessly. I asked if he'd heard about the power outage. He nodded. "The fuse box is in the basement. I was just on my way." Then his gaze flicked to my bag. "Working late, are we?" Something in his tone made me uneasy. I tried to sound casual, mentioning I found a diary. He stiffened. Before he could respond, a clatter echoed from the far end of the gallery. In unison, we turned to look. We raced towards the sound, which seemed to come from the museum's central exhibit, a grand Egyptian sarcophagus that always drew crowds during the day. Among the shadows, we found a toppled display stand, shattered glass, and scattered shards of pottery. Someone had sabotaged this area, as though they were searching for something in a panic. Mr. Darnell swore under his breath. He demanded to see what was in my bag. My gut twisted. Why was he so desperate to see that diary? My mind flashed to the revelations inside it. Someone revered had orchestrated the old theft. Could that person have been a mentor or even a relative of Mr. Darnell? I refused, snapping that I was only doing my job. We argued in hushed tones. He insisted that unreleased documents must stay in the archives for verification. I retorted that items kept vanishing, so I wanted the diary safe. Our conversation was cut short by a faint beam of torchlight flickering across an adjacent corridor. We both froze, watching a figure slip away. Mr. Darnell muttered that maybe the security guard was investigating, but something in my gut told me that wasn't a mere guard. The posture was tense, furtive. I whispered that we should follow. He looked reluctant but nodded. We crept along, each step echoing in the hush. The corridor led towards the basement stairs. The figure's torch bobbed in the darkness. Descending into the basement felt surreal. The old stone steps were damp, the air thick with the smell of age. I recalled reading that the museum was built on older foundations, possibly even over medieval cellars. The figure ahead disappeared around a bend. We pressed on, my heart rattling against my ribs. At the bottom, we found a row of utility rooms. One was open, a thin slice of light spilling out. Mr. Darnell gestured for me to stay back as he approached, but I stayed close. I needed answers, and I feared leaving him alone. Inside the room, the intruder knelt before the fuse box, rummaging with cables. At first, I thought they were trying to restore power, but the flicker of sparks suggested otherwise. They were damaging it. Before we could react, Mr. Darnell flicked on his phone torch and aimed it at the intruder's face. It was Karen, the archivist. Her expression was wild, desperate. She shielded her eyes from the light, dropping a screwdriver with a clang. Mr. Darnell gasped. "Karen, what the devil are you doing?" She glared at him, trembling. "I have to. I won't let it come out," she said, voice shaking. Then she kicked at the fuse box, causing a shower of sparks. I let out a shriek. Mr. Darnell lunged forward to stop her, but she dodged, grabbed her torch, and darted past us, heading back upstairs. We stared at each other in shock. The faint overhead light in the basement flickered again, then died completely. Darkness swallowed us, broken only by our phone torches. My mind spun. Karen was behind the sabotage, destroying evidence, maybe linked to the old theft. Why? We scrambled upstairs, stumbling in near darkness. By the time we reached the main floor, Karen was nowhere in sight. The museum felt like a haunted shell, each corridor cloaked in shadows. A hush fell, broken only by our ragged breathing. I asked Mr. Darnell if Karen had ties to the museum's past. He hesitated. then admitted she was the granddaughter of someone once employed here in the 1970s, a person singled out as a suspect in that old theft. My heart dropped. So Karen had a direct stake in burying the truth. She must have known the diary threatened her family's name or even implicated them. We moved towards the main entrance, hoping to find the security guard station. But every corridor was dark, every door locked. My phone had no signal. I tried to stay calm, but adrenaline surged. We found the guard station empty, the seat overturned. Mr. Darnell cursed under his breath. A crackle from a walkie-talkie on the desk made me jump. I grabbed it, calling out, but got only static. In the gloom, I glimpsed something. A small piece of cloth snagged on the station's corner, identical to Karen's archivist uniform. She must have confronted the guard, or worse. Suddenly, a shrill alarm blared. The intrusion alarm had kicked in, probably triggered by the sabotage. Red emergency lights flashed overhead, bathing the corridors in a stuttering glow. My ears rang from the siren's wail. Over the din, I heard footsteps pounding. I turned to see Karen racing towards the grand staircase, a bundle of something in her arms, documents perhaps. I yelled after her, but she vanished upstairs. Mr. Darnell and I gave chase, ascending the marble steps. It felt like a twisted game of cat and mouse. On the upper floor, the flashing red lights revealed half-finished exhibitions closed to the public. Karen had dashed into one of them. I followed, scanning the gloom for any sign of movement. The alarm blared, echoing off the high ceilings. At last, near a half-constructed display of medieval weapons, I spotted her rummaging frantically in a metal bin. She yanked out a can of solvent or some chemical used for cleaning artifacts. My stomach flipped as I realized her intent. She was going to burn the evidence. I shouted for her to stop. She whirled around, brandishing the container. "Stay back," she hissed, eyes wild. "I won't let my grandfather's name be smeared. That diary is a lie." I tried to speak calmly, explaining I only wanted the truth. She scoffed, tears glistening. "He died disgraced. If people see that diary, they'll confirm he was guilty, or they'll spin it into something worse." Her voice cracked. "He was a good man." I felt a pang of sympathy. Maybe her grandfather was set up. But destroying the diary wouldn't bring closure. I stepped forward, palm raised. "Let's talk. We can figure out what really happened." She shook her head vehemently, tearing open the can's lid. Before she could douse the documents, Mr. Darnell grabbed a medieval shield from a nearby stand and lunged, trying to knock the can away. They collided in a chaotic swirl. The container clanged to the floor, liquid splashing across the exhibits, the floor, and some papers. A pungent smell filled the air. I scrambled to snatch the diary from my bag, worried the liquid had soaked everything. Karen screamed, diving for a nearby toolkit. She found a lighter. My blood chilled. If she flicked it, we'd have a blaze on our hands, potentially destroying centuries of exhibits. Desperate, I tackled her. We both crashed onto the wooden platform. The lighter skittered away, only to be caught by Mr. Darnell. He yelled at Karen to stop this madness. She kicked free, tears streaming, then bolted for the corridor. I lay panting on the floor, relief and terror mixing. She'd lost her chance to set the place aflame, but she was still on the loose. Mr. Darnell helped me up, face pale. The alarm continued to shriek, my ears throbbing. We stumbled back downstairs, unsure if the outside alarm was summoning the police or if the sabotage had cut us off. At last, in the main lobby, we saw torch beams through the glass doors. The cavalry had arrived, 2 uniformed officers, plus the real night guard, who must have raised the alarm once he regained consciousness or escaped. They forced the doors open. I nearly wept with relief. Over the siren's racket, we explained there was a rogue staff member inside. The officers advanced, guns at the ready, while Mr. Darnell and I tried to keep up. We found Karen near the archives, cornered by one of the officers. She was trembling, clutching the stolen records. The officer disarmed her of a small blade I hadn't even noticed she'd grabbed. She broke down sobbing, babbling about her grandfather's innocence. My chest tightened. This poor archivist, tangled in a decades-old scandal, had stooped to sabotage and near arson out of desperation. I coughed from the lingering chemical fumes, clinging to the diary. One officer escorted Karen away, while the other did a sweep of the building. The guard confirmed he'd been knocked out by Karen earlier. She'd taken his keys to sabotage the fuse box. By dawn, the chaos finally settled. The power was partially restored, though half the museum smelled of chemicals and singed plastic from where the sparks had flown. Mr. Darnell, exhausted, told me the museum trustees would be furious. He insisted I hand over the diary, for the sake of preserving evidence. I hesitated. The truth was the diary implicated someone once revered, someone possibly connected to top donors. Part of me feared the museum would bury the findings again. But with the police involved, at least some official record existed now. I photographed every page with an officer present, ensuring a copy. The policeman took my statement along with Mr. Darnell's. Karen was arrested, though for what charges exactly I'm not certain. Attempted arson, assault on the guard, destruction of property. In the aftermath, the museum board made a vague statement about a security incident. They never publicly addressed the old theft scandal or the diary's revelations. Mr. Darnell claimed to support an internal investigation, but I caught wind that he'd recommended sealing all sensitive documents, citing risk to the museum's reputation. I emailed the trustees urging them to release a transparent report on the 1973 case, but received only a polite brush-off. Meanwhile, Karen's story remains murky. I've heard rumors her grandfather was framed by someone far more powerful. Maybe that's the truth she feared would remain hidden. Either way, I doubt she'll see me again anytime soon. As for me, I left town soon after. The hush around that final night unsettled me. I couldn't walk those museum corridors without recalling the alarm screech, the chemical stench, the look in Karen's eyes as she nearly set everything ablaze to protect her family's secret. I had nightmares for weeks. The flickering lights, the looming displays, the sense that something intangible lurked in the darkness, determined to erase inconvenient truths. Even now, I feel a shiver whenever I pass a museum at dusk. I can't forget how easily evidence vanished, how swiftly respected professionals closed ranks to preserve their status. The past never stays dead if people keep burying the facts, and no locked cabinet or archived ledger can hold a secret forever. Sometimes, all it takes is one desperate archivist to shatter the facade. But the echoes of that night, the hush in the halls, remind me that some institutions will go to any length, even sabotage, even threats, to keep certain skeletons in the closet. I've still got my photographic copies of the diary pages, hidden away. I'm not sure what I'll do with them. Part of me wants to release them online, but I worry about retaliation, or about smearing an entire institution over one relic from the past. Another part of me thinks the truth deserves light, no matter how many decades have passed. For now, I'll live with the memory of that savage night, the stolen moments of clarity, and the knowledge that even revered places can harbor rotting secrets. In the end, I left that museum realizing the scariest threats aren't always dramatic showdowns. It's the creeping dread of destroyed evidence, the knowledge that powerful figures might be orchestrating the perfect cover-up, and that someone, somewhere, is ready to burn it all to ashes if it means keeping the truth hidden. I can't say I was popular to begin with, but the abrupt shift from having a comfortable circle of mates to feeling like a leper happened so quickly that I barely noticed the first warning signs. It was my third year at a university up north, one known for its close-knit community. I'd chosen it because of the small class sizes, the friendly vibe. For the first 2 years, everything was grand. I lived with a group of people I considered real friends. I had a steady girlfriend, and I was on track academically. Then, in the span of a week, I went from being included in everything to finding entire campus events happening behind my back, as though I'd never existed. At first, I told myself it was probably a misunderstanding, some scheduling slip, but it only got worse from there. It started on a Monday. I went to the cafe on campus to meet a friend, Sam, for lunch. We'd arranged it via text the night before. I arrived a bit early, grabbed a table. 10 minutes went by, then 20. No sign of Sam. I texted him, only to see the dreaded message not delivered. I tried calling, straight to voicemail. Frustrated, I decided to pop over to the media lab, where Sam often hung around. I found him deep in conversation with my other housemate, Lucy. They stopped talking the moment they saw me. The atmosphere turned awkward. I asked if they'd forgotten lunch. Sam frowned, mumbling something about a clash in schedules. Lucy avoided eye contact. I got that sinking feeling that something was off, but I shrugged it away, thinking maybe they were just busy. The following day, I headed to my advanced seminar. Usually, I sat with Lucy. That day, she was nowhere to be found, though I spotted her slip in 5 minutes after the lecture began, deliberately sitting on the far side of the room. Afterwards, she left with a group of classmates I knew, ignoring me. My stomach twisted. I tried to recall if I'd done anything to upset them. I replayed the weekend. We'd gone out for drinks on Saturday, had a laugh. Sunday, I studied at the library. Nothing dramatic, no arguments. So what changed? By Wednesday, I was effectively ghosted by everyone in our friend circle, mates in the dorm, classmates from my major. My phone was weirdly quiet, no new group chat messages. I tried to ask Lucy directly, but she brushed past me, muttering, "I can't talk to you right now." Sam wouldn't even meet my gaze. My girlfriend, Haley, had been away visiting her family that week, so I texted her frantically, asking if she knew what was going on. No response. Anxiety gnawed at me. I worried something terrible had happened, like a rumor or a misunderstanding. That evening, I discovered I'd been removed from a group project chat, the one I needed to coordinate for an assignment. Panic set in. The project was due soon and I was cut out. I confronted another course mate, Aisha, cornering her in the corridor. She looked nervous, glancing around as though she didn't want to be seen talking to me. "Please," I begged, "tell me what's happening." Eventually, she whispered that someone had circulated a screenshot that supposedly proved I'd cheated on Haley while she was away. The entire circle was outraged. My jaw dropped. It was ridiculous. I'd never cheated, never even considered it. Aisha hissed that the screenshot was from a dating app, showing my photo and some explicit messages. My head spun. I'd never used a dating app. Where had it come from? I tried to show Aisha my phone to prove I didn't have any such app installed. She just shook her head. "They said you'd try to deny it. Lucy said she saw the messages on your phone." Lucy? She'd never gone near my mobile. This was beyond bizarre. I stammered that I was innocent, but Aisha scurried off, saying she didn't want trouble. That night, alone in my dorm room, I paced, tears of frustration burning my eyes. My phone was silent. Haley still hadn't replied. My texts to Lucy and Sam were unread. The more I thought about it, the more suspicious it seemed. Why would Lucy accuse me of cheating, unless someone had doctored evidence? But who? The next morning, I tried visiting Haley's flat, hoping she'd returned. Her flatmate said she wasn't in. I left a handwritten note, begging her to call me. No luck. I felt so isolated on campus. People who used to greet me with a smile now eyed me with scorn or simply looked away. My lectures felt agonizing, as if the entire room buzzed with judgment. I dreaded going back to my dorm, suspecting my housemates might have locked me out. Indeed, on Thursday night, I found my key no longer worked on the front door. When I knocked, Sam answered with a stony expression, telling me I needed to find somewhere else to stay. He wouldn't give me a reason. I stood there, numb, as the door slammed in my face. I trudged to the student union building, hoping to crash on someone's sofa. My phone battery was low. That's when I got a message from an unknown number. "Now you see what it's like. Don't bother trying to fix it. This is your punishment." My blood ran cold. Who the hell was behind this? I typed back, demanding answers, only to get no reply. That's when I remembered that a year ago, I'd had a falling out with a friend named Chloe. We'd parted on bad terms because she blamed me for a fiasco in a group presentation. Could she be behind the screenshot? But she'd left the university last term. My mind whirled, searching for motives. I tried to stay in the union lounge that night. The security staff eventually told me to leave. With nowhere else to go, I wandered the campus in a daze, eventually nodding off in a common area couch near the library. I felt like a pariah in my own university. Then, Friday morning, I spotted Lucy heading into the library. Desperate, I followed her and cornered her in a study carrel. She looked terrified. "Please," I said, voice quivering, Just tell me why you're doing this." She stared at me, tears in her eyes. I can't talk. They said if I talk to you, they'll reveal something worse. I'm sorry." My frustration boiled. "Who said that? I'm being framed." Lucy shook her head, stammering something about messages that she couldn't show me. Then she bolted, leaving me more confused. On Saturday morning, I decided to check my email from a campus computer, since I no longer felt safe returning to my dorm for my laptop. Buried in my inbox was an email from a random domain titled, "We can fix this." The message read, "Meet me at the deserted theater building at closing time. Bring no one. I know the truth." My pulse pounded. This could be a trap, but it was my only lead. Maybe someone was trying to help me. The theater building on campus had been closed for renovation. At about 8:30 that evening, I crept over. The sky was dark, the campus mostly quiet. My stomach churned with nerves. I slipped inside the old theater through a side door that had been left ajar. The corridors were dimly lit by emergency lights. Dust motes drifted in the stale air. I called out, "Hello?" No response. My phone had barely any battery left, but I turned on its torch. Every step echoed on the worn floorboards. Part of me expected to see Lucy or Sam jump out. Instead, at the far end of the corridor, I saw a figure in a hoodie. They beckoned me closer. My adrenaline surged. When I got near, they lowered their hood, revealing Haley, my girlfriend. Relief flooded me, and I stammered how glad I was to see her, but her eyes were filled with hurt. "Did you do it?" she asked quietly. "Did you cheat?" I pleaded my innocence, heartbroken that she'd even consider I was capable of that. She stared at me for a long moment, then handed me her phone. There on the screen was a screenshot of a dating profile with my photo and a string of filthy messages, ones that referenced personal details only someone close to me would know. My mind reeled. "It's fake. I swear," I sobbed. "Someone's gone to a lot of trouble to ruin me." Haley's lip trembled. "I want to believe you. But Lucy, Sam, everyone says it's real. They saw more screenshots. I didn't know what to do." I sank onto a dusty bench, burying my face in my hands. "I have no clue who or why," I said, "but they've manipulated everyone, locked me out, turned you all against me." Haley sat beside me, uncertain. "Why meet me here?" I asked. She said she'd received an anonymous email claiming I was innocent, that if she wanted the truth, she should come here. Now we were both there, alone, with no sign of the supposed informant. The realization dawned that maybe we'd been lured. "This could be a setup," I whispered, scanning the corridor. At that moment, the overhead lights flickered. Footsteps echoed behind us. We leapt to our feet as a second figure emerged from the shadows, wearing a black face covering. They pointed a phone at us, like they were filming. My heart thumped. The figure typed on their screen. Then a robotic voice app piped up. "You took everything from me. Now I'll take everything from you." My mind scrambled for who this could be. The figure advanced, shining a bright torch in our eyes. Haley shouted, "Who are you? Why are you doing this?" They stepped closer, brandishing the phone. The artificial voice repeated, "You ruined my life. Did you think I'd forget?" I felt a creeping sense of dread. This was beyond a simple vendetta. They'd engineered a massive smear campaign, but how had I ruined anyone's life? I racked my memory, stumbling over every potential fallout I'd caused. Could it be a mistaken identity? The figure's chest heaved with anger. Then, in a flash, they turned and ran down the corridor, deeper into the building. Haley and I chased after them, our combined torches illuminating dusty seats, old stage props. The theater felt like a maze. At last, we cornered them near the backstage area. They were breathing hard. I tried to approach calmly. "Listen, I don't know what you think I did," I said, voice shaking. "But I promise, if you just talk to me, we can sort this out." They shook their head fiercely, tapping on the phone. The robotic voice said, "You stole my identity, made me lose my scholarship." My brain reeled. Scholarship? Identity theft? Did they think I impersonated them? Could there be a bizarre confusion? Haley stepped forward. "You've hurt so many people. My friend group is in chaos," she said. tears brimming. "He's not who you think he is." The figure let out a choked laugh. "I saw your name on the forms, the complaint that cost me my place, my entire future." Another wave of confusion slammed into me. I'd never filed a complaint against anyone. "Please, show me," I begged. But they dashed behind a prop set. We scrambled after them, only to find them gone, presumably through a side exit. The theater door banged shut somewhere in the darkness. We were left panting, uncertain if we'd just encountered a dangerous stalker or a deeply misguided student. In the days that followed, I managed to corner Sam and Lucy separately, along with a couple of others. With Haley by my side, vouching for me, we pieced together bits of the puzzle. This mysterious person had apparently circulated documents proving I'd lodged a complaint under their name. They also forged my photo onto a dating profile, added vile messages, twisting half-known personal details. Slowly, Lucy admitted she'd never actually seen the messages on my phone. She'd only seen screenshots from an anonymous tip. Sam felt horrible for locking me out. Meanwhile, Haley apologized for doubting me. My entire circle was outraged they'd been manipulated. Yet we still didn't know the culprit's identity or motive, beyond references to a stolen scholarship. It seemed we had a case of mistaken identity or fabricated evidence. Possibly my name was similar to someone else's who truly did file a damaging complaint. It took nearly a month for the dust to settle. I had to meet with campus authorities, show them everything. They confirmed no complaint had ever been filed by me. The suspicious person never reappeared in public. Some speculated they weren't even a student, just an outsider with a grudge who infiltrated campus. Others whispered they were indeed an old classmate harboring resentment, using the shadows to sabotage my life. Either way, they vanished, leaving me with a battered reputation that took time to mend. Haley and I patched things up, though the trust needed careful rebuilding. Lucy, Sam, and others apologized profusely, realizing how quickly they believed a screenshot over our years of friendship. I accepted their apologies, but a part of me still feels the sting of that sudden exclusion. I never truly felt safe again at that university, always looking over my shoulder in case the hooded figure reappeared. Looking back, the scariest part wasn't the direct confrontation in the theater. It was the creeping social terror of losing everyone in a heartbeat, the sense that a single rumor or faked screenshot could topple everything I'd built. The isolation, the hush in hallways, the feeling that you're being watched and judged at every turn. Those were the true horrors. Even after the truth emerged, a residual wariness lingered. I learned how fragile campus friendships can be, how quickly loyalty can shatter under manufactured doubt. In the end, I never discovered who that silent figure truly was, or how they gained so much personal information about me. But I still recall that robotic voice promising punishment. The chill it sent down my spine remains, a reminder that sometimes you don't need ghosts or monsters for a nightmare. All it takes is a vengeful individual with the right digital tools, ready to twist your life into a web of suspicion and exclusion.